The static never lies on the ice roads, but sometimes it tells you things you don't want to hear. My name is Marcus Henderson, though everyone calls me Tank, and I've been running freight up the Dalton Highway for 14 years. Long enough to know every mile marker between Fairbanks and Deadhorse. Long enough to read weather patterns in the color of the sky. And long enough to trust my CB radio more than most people trust their own families. Out here, Channel 19 isn't just communication, it's survival. The night it started, I was 3 hours into a standard run, hauling drilling equipment to Prudhoe Bay. February in Alaska means 16 hours of darkness and temperatures that can freeze spit before it hits the ground. Mile marker 197 was coming up. A stretch of road I'd driven so many times I could navigate it blindfolded. Nothing special about it, just another piece of frozen asphalt cutting through the wilderness. I'd been listening to the usual chatter on the radio. Big Mike from Anchorage complaining about his dispatcher. Sweet Lorraine sharing weather updates from her run south. The static was clean that night, cleaner than it had any right to be, with the aurora dancing overhead like green fire. That should have been my first warning. At 11:43 p.m., my radio crackled to life, with a transmission that made my blood turn to ice water. Mayday, Mayday, this is Tank Henderson on the Dalton Highway, mile marker 197. I'm caught in a whiteout, zero visibility, can't see my own hood, temperatures dropping fast, engines starting to freeze. If anybody can hear this, I need immediate assistance. Repeat, this is Tank Henderson, requesting emergency assistance. The voice was mine. Not similar to mine, not close to mine. It was my voice, with my speech patterns, my accent, even the slight rasp I get when I'm tired. But I wasn't speaking. I was sitting there, microphone in my lap, staring at the radio like it had just grown teeth. I keyed the mic with shaking fingers. Breaker 19, this is Tank Henderson. Who's using my handle? Silence. Just clean, impossible static. Big Mike came back immediately. Tank, what are you talking about, buddy? You just called for help. No, Mike, I didn't. Someone else just used my call sign. Partner, I've been listening to you jaw on this highway for 8 years. That was your voice asking for help. You feeling all right up there? I checked my GPS, my speedometer, my mirrors, everything normal. Clear night, light wind, temperature holding steady at -34. No sign of weather trouble anywhere. I'm fine, Mike. Everything's clear up here. Well, somebody's having radio troubles, Sweet Lorraine chimed in. Tank, honey, you sounded scared to death. But I hadn't transmitted anything. I was sure of it. The next night, same stretch of highway, same time, 11:43 p.m. The radio erupted with my voice again, more desperate this time. This is Tank Henderson, mile marker 197, emergency situation. The whiteout came out of nowhere, winds howling like the end of the world. I can hear something moving outside my cab, but I can't see what it is. Engine died 10 minutes ago. Getting real cold in here. If anyone's listening, tell my wife The transmission cut to static. This time I was ready. I'd been recording on my phone, waiting. I played it back, compared it to my own voice saying the same words. Perfect match. Every inflection, every pause, even the way I said real cold instead of really cold. Mike, Lorraine, tell me you heard that. Heard what, Tank? Mike's voice was concerned now. You've been quiet for the last hour. The Mayday call. Someone's broadcasting distress calls using my voice. Long pause. Tank, nobody's been on the radio for 20 minutes, except Sweet Lorraine, giving us a weather update. You sure you're not having equipment problems? I checked every connection, every antenna, every piece of radio equipment in my cab. Everything tested normal. But when I called the Alaska State Troopers to report someone using my call sign, they had no record of any distress calls on Channel 19 for the past 48 hours. The third night, I almost turned around. Mile marker 197 was coming up. and my hands were sweating despite the cold. I'd spent the day checking weather reports, calling every forecasting service from Fairbanks to Barrow. Clear skies predicted for the next 72 hours. No weather systems anywhere near Alaska's North Slope. At 11:42, I pulled over and parked. Waited. 11:43 came and went. Nothing. 11:44. Still nothing. At 11:45, I started to feel foolish. Equipment malfunction, just like everyone said. Stress playing tricks on my mind. I put the truck in gear and started rolling again. The radio exploded with static so violent, it hurt my ears. Mayday! This is Tank Henderson. The storm, Jesus Christ, the storm. It's not natural. The snow is falling upward, and the wind is screaming like something alive. I can see lights in the whiteout, but they're not headlights. They're moving wrong, circling my truck. The temperature gauge just hit -60, and it's still dropping. My windows are frosting over from the inside. Something's knocking on my door, but there's nobody out there. There can't be anybody out there. My voice, screaming with terror I'd never felt. If anyone finds this recording, tell them the weather service was wrong. Tell them the storm was real. Tell them it came from static. Then nothing. I sat there shaking, staring at the radio. The recording on my phone showed the exact same thing as before. No transmission detected. According to every piece of equipment I owned, the channel had been silent. But I knew what I'd heard. The fourth night, I called in sick. Told my dispatcher I was having radio problems. Needed to get my equipment checked. Spent the day in Fairbanks having every piece of electronics in my truck tested by the best technician in Alaska. Everything checked perfect. The fifth night, I tried a different route. Took the long way around, avoiding mile marker 197 entirely. At 11:43 p.m., no matter where I was, my radio would crackle with my voice calling for help. It was always the same progression. First night, calm distress call. Second night, growing panic. Third night, pure terror and warnings about an impossible storm. Fourth night onward, just screaming until the transmission cut to static. By the 10th night, other truckers started avoiding me. Word gets around fast on the CB network. Tank's losing it. They'd whisper when they thought I couldn't hear. Radio problems, they'd say, but their voices carried doubt. I started driving the route anyway, just to prove I wasn't crazy. Every night, mile marker 197, 11:43 p.m. My voice, calling from 3 days in the future, warning about a storm that would never come, until the night it did. February 23rd, 2019. I was approaching mile marker 197 when the sky began to change. No clouds, no wind, just a subtle shift in the color of the darkness overhead. The aurora, which had been dancing green and gold all evening, suddenly twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. At 11:41, snow began to fall, not down up, tiny flakes rising from the road surface like reverse gravity, swirling in patterns that made my eyes water. My radio was silent. At 11:42, the wind started. Not the steady Arctic wind I knew, but something that shrieked and howled with voices I almost recognized. The temperature gauge, which had been holding at -35, began dropping fast. -40, -50, -60. The windows started frosting over from the inside. At 11:43, I keyed my microphone with numb fingers. Mayday, Mayday. This is Tank Henderson on the Dalton Highway. Mile marker 197. I'm caught in a whiteout. Zero visibility. Can't see my own hood. Temperatures dropping fast. Engines starting to freeze. If anybody can hear this, I need immediate assistance. As I spoke the words, I heard them echoing from my radio speakers. Not a transmission delay, a perfect synchronization, like I was speaking in harmony with myself. The voice on the radio was mine from 3 days ago, and I was fulfilling the prophecy I'd been hearing all along. The storm raged for 6 hours. When it finally passed, I found myself parked in the exact same spot where I'd stopped that first night, my truck covered in ice formations that shouldn't have been possible in Earth's atmosphere. The Alaska State Troopers found me the next morning, hypothermic but alive. The Weather Service had no record of any storm. According to their instruments, it had been a clear, calm night across the entire North Slope. But my radio, when they tested it, was full of recordings I'd never made. Hours of my voice, calling for help from dates that hadn't happened yet. Warnings about storms that were still 3 days in the future. I don't drive the ice roads anymore. Can't trust my radio. Can't trust the weather reports. Can't trust the sound of my own voice. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it crackling through the static. Tank Henderson, calling for help from tomorrow, warning about storms that haven't happened yet. The echo never came back. It just keeps moving forward, 3 days ahead of time, forever calling for help that will always be too late. Some mirrors show you things that haven't happened yet, and the worst part is knowing they will. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've been running supplies to diamond mines across the Northwest Territories for 8 years. The Tibet to Contuwaito Winter Road isn't like the southern highways most truckers know. It's a temporary scar carved across frozen lakes and tundra, existing only during the coldest months, when the ice grows thick enough to support fully loaded trucks. For 4 months each year, it's a lifeline to some of the most remote mines on Earth. For the other 8 months, it disappears entirely, leaving only memory and GPS coordinates to mark where it once was. I specialized in the difficult runs, the ones that required precise timing and ice-reading skills that took years to develop. My truck, a midnight blue Kenworth with chrome stacks that caught the aurora light, had crossed every frozen lake between Yellowknife and the Diamond Fields. I knew the sound ice makes under 40 tons of truck and trailer a deep, resonant groan that speaks of strength. I knew the difference between safe ice and the thin, singing ice that means death. Most importantly, I knew my own reflection in the side mirrors, the way my headlights cut through the Arctic darkness, and the distinctive rumble of my engine that other drivers could identify from miles away on the CB radio. These details matter when you're alone, on roads that exist only in winter, where the nearest help might be 100 miles away, and the temperature can kill you in minutes if your truck breaks down. The night it happened, I was 3 hours into a run from Yellowknife to the Snap Lake mine, carrying replacement drilling bits and hydraulic fluid. The temperature outside was holding steady at minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ice conditions were perfect, thick, solid, and singing that deep note that meant I could trust it with my life. I just finished crossing Lac de Gras, one of the largest lakes on the route, when I saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. Nothing unusual about that. The winter road sees steady traffic during the season, trucks running both directions around the clock to maximize the short window when transport is possible. But as the headlights grew closer, something felt wrong. The light pattern was familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. 2 main beams with the slight asymmetry caused by a small crack in my left headlight, housing a crack I'd been meaning to fix for months but kept forgetting about. The truck approaching me was identical to mine. Same midnight blue paint job, same chrome stacks, same proportions. As we drew closer, I could see the driver was a woman about my age, wearing the same style of winter jacket I preferred. Her hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail I always used on long runs. I keyed my CB radio. Channel 19. Southbound Kenworth approaching Lac de Gras. This is Sarah Chen northbound. You're looking at some thin ice about 2 miles south of your position. Might want to swing wide around the eastern shore. The response came immediately, in my own voice. Copy that, Sarah. I see the stress fractures you're talking about. Thanks for the heads up. This ice gets tricky this time of year. I hadn't said anything about stress fractures. I hadn't even seen any. But as the words came through my radio in my own voice, I found myself looking more carefully at the ice ahead of the other truck. There, exactly where my voice had mentioned them, hairline cracks were spreading across the surface like a spider web. The other truck, my truck, passed me, going the opposite direction. I caught a glimpse of the driver's face in the split second we crossed paths. It was my face, but wrong somehow. The expression was different, more worried than I felt, and her eyes seemed to be looking at something behind me rather than ahead. I checked my mirrors, but she was already disappearing into the darkness, taillights fading to red pinpricks against the vast white expanse. I tried to rationalize it. Trucking companies often bought fleets of identical vehicles. Maybe another driver had coincidentally chosen similar modifications. The voice similarity could be explained by radio distortion, though I'd never heard static that perfectly preserved speech patterns and accent. But the stress fractures were real. I could see them clearly now, spreading exactly where my own voice had warned they would be. 20 minutes later, my radio crackled again. "Northbound Kenworth, this is southbound Sarah. You've got a caribou herd crossing about 5 miles ahead. Big bull leading about 30 animals. They spooked at my engine noise and scattered onto the road surface." I hadn't transmitted anything. I was listening, not talking. But the voice was undeniably mine, down to the slight rasp I get when I've been driving too long without water. "Southbound Sarah, this is northbound Sarah," I replied, testing the impossible. "What's your truck number and company?" Silence. Just the clean static of empty airwaves. 5 miles later, I found the caribou, a large bull and about 30 others, exactly as described, standing confused on the ice road in the sweep of my headlights. They scattered as I approached, but slowly, as if they'd already been disturbed recently by another truck passing through. The pattern repeated throughout the night. My voice would come through the radio, warning me about conditions ahead, a rough patch where frost heaves had buckled the ice, a section where wind had blown snow across the road surface, areas where other trucks had left ruts that were already starting to refreeze into dangerous ridges. Each warning was accurate. Each time, I found exactly what my own voice had described, but I never transmitted the warnings myself. I was always the one listening, never the one speaking. Around 3 in the morning, I reached the section of road that crosses McKay Lake, a long, straight stretch where you can see headlights from miles away. The lake surface was perfect that night, smooth as glass and thick enough to support 3 times the weight I was carrying. That's when I saw her again. My truck, approaching from the opposite direction for the second time that night. Same headlights, same distinctive crack in the left beam casting that familiar asymmetrical pattern. As we grew closer, I could see the driver more clearly through the windshield. She was looking directly at me this time, and her expression was one of pure terror. She keyed her radio. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. Don't look behind you. Whatever you do, don't turn around and look behind you. Just keep driving straight, and don't stop until you reach the mine." I looked in my rearview mirror instinctively. The mirror showed empty road stretching back into darkness. Nothing but the twin tracks my tires had pressed into the snow. But something was wrong with the reflection. The road surface looked different, older somehow, as if years had passed since I'd driven over it. "Sarah, I'm serious," my own voice continued over the radio, more urgent now. "You're going to want to look back. You're going to think you see something following you, but it's not real. It's just the lake showing you what it wants you to see." The other truck passed me again, and this time the driver, my other self, pressed her hand against the side window as we crossed paths. I could see her mouth moving, saying words I couldn't hear over the engine noise. She was trying to warn me about something, but her expression suggested it was already too late. After she disappeared behind me, I couldn't stop myself from checking the mirrors every few seconds. The road remained empty, but the reflection kept changing subtly. Sometimes it looked like I was driving through a forest instead of across frozen tundra. Sometimes the sky showed daylight instead of the endless Arctic night. Sometimes there were other vehicles in the mirror trucks that hadn't been on the road when I'd passed that section. My radio stayed silent for the rest of the journey, but I kept expecting to hear my own voice warning me about hazards that hadn't appeared yet. When I finally reached the Snap Lake mine at dawn, I was exhausted and shaking from something that had nothing to do with the cold. The mine supervisor logged my arrival time and cargo manifest, everything normal and routine. But when I asked if any other trucks had come through during the night, specifically another midnight blue Kenworth, he looked at me strangely. "You're the only truck we've seen in 3 days," he said. "Weather's been keeping everyone else stuck in Yellowknife. I still run the winter roads, though I've switched to a different truck and a different paint job. But sometimes, on the longest crossings, I catch glimpses of midnight blue headlights in my mirrors. They're always traveling the opposite direction, always driven by someone who looks like I used to look when I trusted that mirrors only showed what was behind me. The radio in my new truck has never picked up transmissions from my own voice, but I keep it tuned to channel 19 anyway, waiting for warnings about hazards I haven't encountered yet. Someday I might be the one giving the warnings, trying to help another version of myself navigate the thin ice between what is and what might be. The winter road still crosses the same frozen lakes, following the same route. But I know now that mirrors can lie. And sometimes the most dangerous thing on the ice isn't the cold or the isolation, it's meeting yourself, coming the other way, trying to warn you about something you won't understand until it's too late to change course. The worst part about losing time isn't the missing hours, it's knowing something filled them that your mind refuses to remember clearly. My name is Robert Kowalski, though everyone calls me Big Jim, and I've been running freight across the Canadian Arctic for 19 years. Started when the Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk Highway was just a winter road, nothing but packed snow and ice connecting the inland communities to the Arctic Ocean. When they built the permanent all-weather highway in 2017, I was one of the first drivers to make the official run on the new pavement. 137 kilometers of road where none had existed before, cutting through some of the most remote territory on Earth. The highway runs straight north from Inuvik, through tundra and past countless small lakes, ending at Tuktoyaktuk on the shores of the Beaufort Sea. During winter, it's one of the loneliest roads in North America. You can drive for hours without seeing another vehicle. Just endless white landscape under skies that range from pale gray to deep purple, depending on the time of day. The settlements along the route are small Inuvik at the southern end with about 3,000 people, and Tuktoyaktuk at the northern terminus with maybe 1,000 souls brave enough to call the edge of the Arctic Ocean home. I specialized in supply runs to the research stations and government facilities scattered along the route. Medical supplies, communications equipment, food shipments for the communities that relied on trucked-in goods during the months when ice prevented marine deliveries. It was steady work that required security clearances and careful documentation, the kind of cargo that government officials took seriously, with paperwork that had to match perfectly at every checkpoint. Which is why I didn't question it when I saw the checkpoint. It was March 15th, 2021, about 60 kilometers north of Inuvik. I was hauling communications equipment and medical supplies to the research station at Tuktoyaktuk, a routine run I'd made dozens of times. The weather was clear, temperature holding at -28, and I was making good time on roads that were dry and well-maintained despite the late winter conditions. The checkpoint appeared exactly where it should have been, a temporary-looking structure with official vehicles parked alongside, the kind of setup I'd seen countless times over the years. 2 uniformed officers stepped out as I approached, their breath visible in the cold air, gestures crisp and professional as they directed me to pull over. The senior officer was a middle-aged man with graying hair visible under his winter cap. His partner looked younger, maybe 30, with the alert posture of someone relatively new to the job. Both wore standard government-issue winter uniforms, with proper identification badges, though something about the badges struck me as odd. They seemed newer than they should have been, the laminates too clear, and the photos too sharp. "Good afternoon, Mr. Kowalski," the senior officer said, checking his clipboard. "Routine cargo inspection today. I'll need to see your manifest and security documentation." I handed over the paperwork. noting that he'd used my name without looking at my license first. Professional courtesy. I figured after 19 years on these roads, most of the regular officials knew me by sight. Communications, equipment, and medical supplies bound for the Tuktoyaktuk research station, the younger officer read from my manifest. Standard governmental priority shipment. Everything looks in order here. They were thorough, more thorough than usual. They examined every seal on the trailer, cross-referenced serial numbers with their own documentation, and asked detailed questions about my route and timing. The senior officer wanted to know about my fuel stops, my rest periods, and whether I'd noticed any unusual activity along the highway. "Any other vehicles on the road today?" he asked, making notes on his clipboard. "Haven't seen another truck since leaving Inuvik," I replied. "Pretty quiet out there." "That's what we like to hear," he said, but his expression remained serious. "Mr. Kowalski, we're going to need to do a detailed inspection of your cargo compartment. New security protocols. Should take about 30 minutes. They spent the next 40 minutes going through everything with methodical precision. Every box opened, every item examined, every serial number verified against their lists. They worked with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. But something about their movements seemed slightly off, like they were following a script they'd memorized but didn't quite understand. During the inspection, I noticed details that should have raised flags. Their radio chattered constantly with status updates, but I never heard actual responses, just static and dead air. Their vehicle license plates were government-issued but looked freshly manufactured, without the usual wear and dirt you'd expect from official vehicles working in Arctic conditions. Most unsettling was the way they handled my cargo. They knew exactly what to look for, checking specific items that weren't listed on the manifest I'd given them. When I asked about this, the senior officer explained they had updated information about my shipment that hadn't been communicated to my dispatcher. "Security protocols change rapidly these days," he said. "We get information directly from the source departments." After they finished, both officers shook my hand and wished me safe travels. The senior officer handed me a receipt for the inspection standard procedure and reminded me to report my arrival time when I reached Tuktoyaktuk. "Drive carefully, Mr. Kowalski," he said. "Weather can change quickly this time of year." I drove away thinking about how professional they'd been, how thorough. It wasn't until I was 20 kilometers down the road that I realized I couldn't remember clearly what either officer had looked like. Their faces seemed to blur in my memory, like trying to recall the details of a dream after waking. When I arrived at the Tuktoyaktuk research station 3 hours later, the receiving supervisor looked confused as I handed over the inspection receipt. "What checkpoint?" Dr. Amanda Reeves asked, studying the paper. "There's no checkpoint scheduled for your route today." She called the transportation department while I waited, my unease growing with each passing minute. The conversation was brief and one-sided, mostly Dr. Reeves asking questions and receiving answers that made her frown deeper. "Jim, they're saying there's no checkpoint between Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk. Never has been one at the location you described. Security inspections are only conducted at the origin and destination points." I insisted on what I'd experienced, describing the officers and their procedures in detail. Dr. Reeves made more calls, eventually reaching someone in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who agreed to review highway surveillance footage from the day's traffic. The callback came 2 hours later. Dr. Reeves listened for several minutes, asking occasional questions, before hanging up with an expression I couldn't read. "Jim, I need to show you something," she said, leading me to her computer. The surveillance footage was time-stamped and clear. It showed my truck approaching the location where I remembered the checkpoint, slowing down and pulling over to the shoulder. For the next 47 minutes, the camera recorded me getting out of my truck, walking around the empty highway, and appearing to have detailed conversations with people who weren't there. I watched myself hand documents to empty air, stand patiently while nothing happened, and nod in response to words no one was saying. At one point, I walked to the back of my trailer and opened the doors, standing aside while invisible inspectors examined cargo that no one was actually touching. The footage showed me alone on an empty stretch of highway, talking animatedly to nobody for nearly an hour. The RCMP ran the recording through their technical analysis unit. Dr. Reeves said quietly, "No signs of editing or manipulation. According to their equipment, you were the only person at that location during the entire time period." I still have the inspection receipt they gave me. The paper is real enough standard government forms with official letterhead and serial numbers. But when the authorities tried to trace those serial numbers, they led to forms that were never printed, issued by a department that doesn't exist. I don't drive the Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk highway anymore. I can't trust what I might see out there. Can't trust my own memory of what happens during those long, empty stretches between communities. Sometimes I wonder what I was really doing during those 47 minutes. What part of my mind decided to create an elaborate fiction about uniformed officers and security protocols? The most unsettling part isn't that I lost time, or that I apparently talked to people who weren't there. It's that I can still remember their faces clearly now, weeks later, when I couldn't recall them immediately after the encounter. The senior officer had kind eyes and a slight scar above his left eyebrow. His partner had nervous hands and kept checking his watch. I remember people who never existed, and I can't forget a conversation that never happened. Sometimes I think that's worse than not remembering anything at all. Sometimes the cargo you delivered decides it doesn't want to be delivered. And the worst part is knowing it's following you home. My name is Jennifer Blackbird, and I've been hauling freight to remote communities across northern Ontario for 12 years. I'm a member of the Atawapiskat First Nation, born and raised on the shores of the Atawapiskat River, where it flows into James Bay. Growing up in a community that depends entirely on winter roads for supplies teaches you the weight of responsibility that comes with every delivery medical supplies, food, fuel, all the necessities that keep people alive through the long Arctic winter months. The winter road to Atawapiskat exists only from January through March, when the ground freezes solid enough to support fully loaded transport trucks. For those 3 months, it's a lifeline, connecting my community to the outside world. The rest of the year, we rely on expensive air transport or summer barges when the ice breaks up on James Bay. During winter road season, I made the run from Timmins to Atawapiskat twice a week, carrying everything from groceries to construction materials to critical medical supplies. I knew every mile of that route, 320 kilometers of packed snow and ice, cutting through boreal forest and muskeg, past countless small lakes, and through terrain that hasn't changed since my ancestors first traveled these paths. The road was temporary, rebuilt each season, but the land underneath held memories that went back generations. My grandmother used to tell stories about the old travel routes, the places where the spirits of the land were strongest, and the importance of treating every journey with respect. On March 8, 2022, I was making what should have been a routine medical supply run. The cargo was particularly important insulin for diabetic community members, antibiotics for a respiratory infection that had been spreading through the settlement, and specialized equipment for the nursing station that served not just Atawapiskat, but several smaller communities in the region. The delivery went smoothly. I arrived at the nursing station just after 2 in the afternoon, and the staff helped me unload everything with their usual efficiency. Nurse Patricia Sinclair, who'd been running the station for 15 years, checked each item against her requisition list and signed off on the delivery receipt. Everything accounted for, everything properly documented, everything exactly where it needed to be. "Thanks for getting this to us so quickly, Jenny," she said, watching her staff carry the last boxes inside. The insulin especially. We had families getting worried about running short. I secured my empty trailer and began the return journey around 4 in the evening, planning to reach Timmins by midnight if the road conditions held good. The weather was clear, temperature steady at -18, and my truck was running smoothly after a recent maintenance check. It should have been an easy drive home. About 50 kilometers south of Ottawa-Piscat, I heard the first rattle. It was subtle at first, just a faint metallic sound from the trailer that could have been explained by road vibration or thermal expansion as the empty cargo box cooled in the Arctic air. But something about the sound pattern bothered me. It had the rhythm of loose cargo, shifting around, the distinctive clatter of boxes sliding across a metal floor. I checked my mirrors, confirming that the trailer doors were properly secured, with the locks I'd fastened myself after the delivery. The rattling continued, growing slightly more pronounced as I drove south through the darkening forest. At the 70-kilometer mark, I pulled over and walked back to check the trailer. The locks were secure, the doors properly sealed, and when I opened them to look inside, the cargo compartment was completely empty. Clean metal floor, tie-down straps hanging loose along the walls. Nothing that could account for the sounds I'd been hearing. But as I stood there in the cold, listening to the silence, I could swear I heard something moving inside. Not rattling now, but a softer sound, like boxes being carefully repositioned by invisible hands. When I climbed into the trailer to investigate, the sounds stopped completely. Everything was still and empty, exactly as it should have been. I climbed back into the cab and continued driving, but the rattling resumed within minutes. This time it was louder, more insistent, like someone was deliberately shaking cargo containers to get my attention. The sound seemed to come from directly behind my head, separated from me by only the thin metal wall between the cab and trailer. Every 20 kilometers, I stopped to check. Every time, the trailer was empty and silent, until I closed the doors and started driving again. The pattern became routine. Drive 20 kilometers, listening to increasingly violent rattling. Stop to find nothing. Continue with the sounds growing worse. By the 100-kilometer mark, the rattling had become so loud it was drowning out my engine noise. It sounded like dozens of heavy boxes crashing into each other, metal striking metal, cargo breaking free from restraints and tumbling around the trailer with every bump and turn in the road. But more disturbing than the volume was the rhythm. The sounds weren't random. They followed patterns that seemed almost like communication. 3 sharp rattles followed by silence, then 5 quick ones, then a long pause. The sequences repeated, as if whatever was making the noise was trying to tell me something in a code I couldn't understand. At the 150-kilometer mark, I called the nursing station on my satellite phone. "Patricia, it's Jenny. Quick question. Did you guys get all the medical supplies I delivered? Everything accounted for?" "Of course, Jenny. Why do you ask?" I explained about the rattling, trying to make it sound like a routine equipment check rather than the growing panic I was feeling. "Hold on. Let me double-check our inventory," Patricia said. I could hear her moving around the station, checking storage areas. "Everything's here, Jenny. Insulin in the refrigeration unit, antibiotics in the pharmacy, all the equipment properly stored. Nothing missing." But as she spoke, the rattling in my trailer shifted to a new pattern, urgent, aggressive sounds, like something trying to break out of confinement. I could hear what sounded like boxes being thrown against the trailer walls with enough force to dent the metal. "Patricia, I need to ask you something that's going to sound strange. Are there any traditional stories about deliveries and axting not staying where they're delivered? About cargo that follows people home?" Long pause. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was different, more careful. "Jenny, where are you right now?" "About 150 kilometers south." "Why?" "My grandmother used to tell stories about that stretch of road. Said there were places where the spirits of people who died waiting for medicine or supplies would try to follow the delivery trucks back to the outside world. She said they didn't understand that their time had passed, that the help they needed couldn't reach them anymore." The rattling suddenly stopped. Complete silence from the trailer, so abrupt it was more unsettling than the noise had been. "Jenny, are you still there?" "Yeah, I'm here." The sounds just stopped. Listen to me carefully. Don't stop to check the trailer again. Drive straight to Timmins without stopping, no matter what you hear. And when you get there, have the trailer blessed before you use it again. Some deliveries carry more than just cargo. I drove the remaining 170 kilometers in absolute silence. No rattling, no phantom cargo sounds, nothing but the steady hum of my engine and the whisper of tires on packed snow. But somehow the silence was worse than the noise had been, because I kept waiting for it to start again, kept expecting to hear something that would confirm I hadn't imagined the whole experience. When I finally reached the trucking depot in Timmins, I backed up to the loading dock and opened the trailer doors one last time. Still empty, still silent, but on the metal floor, clearly visible in the dock lights, were dozens of scratches and dent marks that hadn't been there when I'd loaded the trailer 3 days earlier. I don't haul medical supplies to remote communities anymore. Can't trust what might follow me home. Can't shake the feeling that some needs are so desperate they transcend the normal rules about what gets delivered where. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear rattling sounds from whatever trailer I'm pulling, and I wonder if the cargo that follows home ever really finds what it's looking for. The winter road to Atawapiskat still operates every season, and other drivers make the medical supply runs now. But I always warn them about that stretch between the 100 and 150 kilometer marks, where the rattling starts, and the cargo remembers being needed by people who couldn't wait for spring. Cold has a voice, and when it speaks in temperatures that shouldn't exist on Earth, the only response is absolute silence. My name is Pavel Novak, and I've spent 22 years driving in conditions that would kill most people within minutes of exposure. I started on the winter roads of Siberia, hauling supplies to mining operations and research stations in regions where the temperature regularly dropped below minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. When I immigrated to Canada in 2012, I brought those skills to the Yukon Territory, specializing in freight runs along the Dempster Highway during the worst weather months. The Dempster Highway is 740 kilometers of gravel road connecting Dawson City to Inuvik, cutting through some of the most remote wilderness in North America. During winter, it becomes one of the most challenging driving routes on the continent, with temperatures that can reach minus 60 degrees and weather conditions that change without warning. The road crosses the Arctic Circle at mile 405, marking the transition from subarctic to true Arctic climate. Most of the route has no cell phone coverage, no roadside assistance, and settlements separated by hundreds of kilometers. I specialized in emergency supply runs to the communities along the route, medical supplies, food, fuel, and equipment that couldn't wait for better weather. My truck was equipped with redundant heating systems, emergency survival gear, and temperature monitoring equipment calibrated for extreme cold conditions. After a decade of Siberian winters, I thought I understood what cold could do to machinery, to roads, and to human beings. The night of February 14th, 2023, I was hauling heating fuel and generator parts to Fort McPherson, about 600 kilometers north of Dawson City. The weather forecast called for minus 45 degrees with light snow, typical conditions for that stretch of road in mid-February. My truck was running smoothly, the heating system maintaining a comfortable interior temperature, and I was making good time despite the challenging road surface. At mile marker 231, just south of the Ogilvy River crossing, my temperature gauge began acting strangely. The exterior temperature reading, which had been holding steady at minus 42 degrees, suddenly dropped to minus 55, then minus 60. The change happened over the course of about 30 seconds, far too rapid for natural weather fluctuation. I checked my other instruments. Barometric pressure normal, humidity readings consistent, wind speed unchanged. Only the temperature was behaving erratically. Within minutes, the reading had dropped to minus 75 degrees. I'd never seen temperatures that low, not even during the worst Siberian winters. My engine began running roughly, the diesel fuel thickening despite the heating systems designed to prevent exactly that problem. The windshield started developing frost patterns on the inside surface, something that shouldn't happen with a properly functioning heater. At minus 85 degrees, my CB radio crackled to life with a transmission that made my blood freeze colder than the air outside. Mayday, Mayday, this is northbound trucker mile 230, Dempster Highway. My cab heat just failed. Exterior temp showing minus 90 degrees. Can anyone copy? The voice was panicked, desperate, speaking with a slight Russian accent very similar to my own. But I was the only northbound truck on this stretch of road, and my CB had been silent for hours. Northbound trucker, this is dispatch. We copy your mayday. What's your truck identification and exact location? I hadn't transmitted anything to dispatch. My radio was receiving, not sending. Dispatch, this is Pavel Novak in truck number 774. Something's wrong with my temperature readings. Showing minus 100 degrees now. My engine's starting to freeze solid. I can see ice crystals forming in the air inside my cab. That was my voice, my truck number, my name. But I wasn't speaking. I was listening to myself call for help, while my actual exterior temperature gauge continued its impossible descent. Minus 90, minus 100, minus 110 degrees. The radio continued broadcasting my distress calls while I sat in stunned silence, watching my breath begin to fog, despite the heater running at maximum output. The frost on my windshield was spreading in patterns I'd never seen before, geometric designs that looked almost crystalline, like snowflakes magnified 1,000 times. Dispatch, emergency. Temperature now showing minus 120 degrees. My engine just seized. I'm losing all heat. The air is freezing solid in my lungs. My actual engine was still running, though roughly. My heater was still functioning, though less effectively than before. But the voice on the radio, my voice, was screaming about conditions that would be instantly fatal. At minus 115 degrees on my gauge, something impossible happened. The air inside my cab began to shimmer, like heat waves in reverse. I could see my breath crystallizing before it left my mouth, tiny ice particles forming and falling to the floor of the cab like snow. My CB radio erupted with multiple voices, all calling for help, all reporting temperatures that couldn't exist on Earth. This is Big Mike, mile 235, cab temp dropping fast, everything freezing solid. Red Dog here, mile 228. My fuel lines just exploded from the cold. Convoy leader to any station. We've got 6 trucks stopped dead. Temperatures reading minus 130 degrees. I recognize some of the call signs drivers I'd talked to over the years, truckers who worked the northern routes. But according to my logbook, I was the only vehicle scheduled for this stretch of highway tonight. The voices multiplied, overlapping each other. Dozens of truckers, all reporting the same impossible temperatures at locations clustered around mile marker 231. Some spoke in English, others in French, a few in languages I couldn't identify. All were terrified, all reporting equipment failure and life-threatening cold. My temperature gauge hit minus 127 degrees. The number glowed red on the digital display, a reading that should have been physically impossible. At that temperature, the nitrogen in the atmosphere should have begun condensing. The carbon dioxide in my exhaled breath should have frozen instantly into solid chunks. But somehow I was still alive, still breathing, still able to move and think, even as ice began forming on every surface inside my cab. The steering wheel was slick with frost under my gloves. The gear shifter creaked with ice when I tried to move it. The CB microphone felt like it was made of frozen metal when I finally tried to transmit. Any station, this is Pavel Novak. Is anyone receiving? Over. The response was immediate, my own voice, coming through the radio speakers. Pavel, this is Pavel. I can hear you. The cold is getting worse. I think we're going to die here. Who is this? What's happening? I don't know. The temperature gauge just hit minus 130 degrees. That's impossible, right? That can't be real. I was having a conversation with myself over the CB radio, while my truck sat motionless in temperatures that couldn't exist on Earth. The other Pavel, the one on the radio, sounded exactly like me, but seemed to know things I didn't, experienced things that weren't happening to me. Pavel, listen to me. My radio voice continued. Don't try to restart your engine if it stalls. Don't get out of the truck, no matter what. The cold out there isn't natural. It's from somewhere else. Somewhere else? I don't know where. But it's not Earth cold. It's the cold between stars, the temperature of empty space. Somehow it's leaking through here at mile marker 231. My gauge read minus 129 degrees when my engine finally seized completely. The sudden silence was profound. No engine noise, no heater fan, just the faint crackling of ice forming on every surface, and the continuing chorus of distress calls from my radio. I sat in the growing cold for what felt like hours, listening to other versions of myself and other truckers I'd never met, reporting conditions that would have frozen Mercury solid. The ice buildup inside my cab grew thicker, creating crystalline structures that looked more like alien architecture than natural frost patterns. When the search and rescue team found me 18 hours later, I was unconscious but alive, suffering from severe hypothermia despite my survival gear. The rescue coordinator, a man named David Winters who'd worked northern emergencies for 15 years, showed me photographs of what they'd discovered. My truck was encased in ice formations unlike anything in his experience. The coating was 3 feet thick in some places, formed in spiraling patterns that defied physics. Laboratory analysis of the ice revealed crystalline structures that shouldn't be able to form at any temperature achievable on Earth's surface. Pavel, the weird thing is, David told me later, our weather monitoring stations never recorded temperatures below minus 38 degrees that night. According to every instrument we have, it was a normal winter evening on the Dempster Highway. But I know what I experienced. I know what my temperature gauge recorded. And sometimes, when I drive past mile marker 231 on clear winter nights, I can still hear the voices on Channel 19 truckers calling for help from inside a cold that comes from the spaces between worlds, where the temperature is absolute zero, and the only sound is the silence of infinite night. The Dempster Highway still operates through winter, and other drivers make the runs to the northern communities. But I always warn them about mile marker 231, where the cold sometimes forgets it's supposed to follow the laws of Earth's atmosphere, and the temperature gauge shows numbers that shouldn't be possible on any world where life can exist. The ice tells you stories if you know how to listen. But some stories are warnings you hear too late to matter. My name is Tommy Riverside, and I've been running freight across the Yukon Territory for 16 years. I started young, learned from drivers who'd been working these roads since before GPS existed, back when navigation meant reading the land and trusting your instincts about ice conditions. By the time I was 30, I had a reputation for taking shortcuts that other drivers considered too risky, calculated risks that saved time and fuel, routes across frozen lakes and rivers that cut hours off standard delivery schedules. The shortcut across Whitehorse Lake was one of my regular routes during the deep winter months. The lake sits about 40 kilometers south of Whitehorse City, a natural body of water that freezes solid enough by January to support heavy freight traffic. Most drivers stuck to the official winter road that skirted the lake's eastern shore, adding 25 kilometers to the journey. But I'd been crossing the lake directly for 8 years, always after careful ice testing, always with proper safety equipment, always with backup communication systems. I knew that lake better than some people know their own neighborhoods. I understood its freezing patterns, the way wind and current affected ice formation, and the seasonal variations that determined safe crossing dates. The local First Nations elders had shared traditional knowledge about the lake's behavior, warnings about areas where springs kept the ice unpredictable, stories about winter travelers who'd made successful crossings for generations. But they also shared other stories, older ones, about lights that sometimes moved under the ice during the darkest months, following travelers across the frozen surface. Most drivers dismissed these as folklore, aurora reflections, or the optical effects that extreme cold can create. I'd always been respectful but skeptical, focusing on measurable ice thickness and load-bearing calculations rather than traditional warnings. On the night of January 23rd, 2024, I was hauling construction equipment to a mining project near Dawson City. The load was valuable but not urgent, which gave me flexibility in route planning. Weather conditions were perfect for the lake, crossing clear skies, temperature holding steady at -38 degrees, no wind to speak of. My ice probe readings showed 14 inches of solid ice, well above the minimum thickness needed for my loaded weight. I'd made this same crossing dozens of times, always following the same route across the lake's center where the ice was most reliable. The crossing took about 20 minutes at normal speed, a straight line from the southern access point to the northern shore, where the unofficial road continued toward the Alaska Highway. About 5 minutes into the crossing, my headlights caught something unusual in the ice ahead of me. At first, I thought it was just the way my lights were reflecting off the surface. The ice on Whitehorse Lake had a particular clarity that could create interesting optical effects, especially at night. But as I continued driving, the effect became more distinct. There appeared to be lights underneath the ice, faint but clearly visible, following the same path I was taking across the lake. I stopped the truck and got out to investigate, something I'd done countless times during ice crossings to check conditions or examine surface features. The lights were still there, about 10 feet below the surface, arranged in what looked like the pattern of vehicle headlights. Two bright spots, with the familiar spacing and intensity of truck headlights, moving slowly along the same route I was traveling. I walked ahead of my truck, following the lights for about 50 yards. They moved when I moved, stopped when I stopped, maintaining the same relative position beneath my feet. The ice surface showed no signs of stress, no cracks or deformation that might explain what I was seeing. When I knocked on the ice with my testing probe, it rang solid and thick, exactly as it should have. Back in my truck, I continued the crossing, but the lights remained visible throughout the journey. They seemed to be following my exact route, staying directly beneath my truck as I drove across the lake. Occasionally, they would dim and then brighten, like a vehicle adjusting its headlights or hitting bumps in an underwater road. I radioed my dispatcher to report the unusual sighting, more out of professional habit than concern. "Dispatch, this is Tommy. I'm crossing Whitehorse Lake, and I'm seeing what looks like vehicle lights under the ice. Probably just reflection effects, but wanted to log it." "Copy that, Tommy. Ice conditions still solid?" "Testing shows 14 inches of good ice. No problems with the crossing." But as I spoke, the lights beneath me grew noticeably brighter, as if whatever was down there was ascending toward the surface. I could see them clearly now through my windshield. Two distinct beams that seemed to be rising through the ice like headlights approaching from deep water. "Dispatch, the lights are getting brighter. They're moving upward." "Tommy, say again." I was about to repeat the transmission when the lights below me suddenly intensified to an almost blinding level. The ice beneath my truck began to emit a soft glow, as if lit from below by powerful floodlights. I could see the underwater lights clearly now. They were definitely headlights, and they were rising quickly toward the surface. "Dispatch, I need backup out here. Something's happening with the ice. The lights underneath are getting too bright to look at." The radio crackled with static, then cleared. "Tommy, we're not getting clear transmission. Please repeat your status." But I was transfixed by what I was seeing. The headlights below were now bright enough to illuminate my truck's interior through the ice, casting strange shadows on the cab ceiling. I could make out the shape of what looked like another truck beneath the surface, following my exact path across the lake, climbing through solid ice as if it were water. I accelerated, trying to reach the northern shore before whatever was beneath me could surface completely. The lights followed, maintaining their position directly below my truck, growing brighter with each passing second. The ice around me began to glow with an ethereal blue-white light that made the entire lake's surface look like it was backlit by enormous flood lamps. Dispatch, emergency situation. I've got vehicle lights under the ice, and they're rising toward the surface. The ice is glowing. I'm heading for shore as fast as I can safely drive. Tommy, your transmission is breaking up. What's your location? The lights beneath me were now so bright I had to squint to see the shore ahead. I could hear sounds through the ice engine noise, the rumble of a heavy truck driving on some impossible road beneath 12 feet of solid ice. The sounds were getting louder, as if the underwater vehicle was approaching the surface. With about 200 yards to go before reaching shore, the lights below me reached maximum intensity. The ice surface was glowing like daylight, bright enough to cast shadows from my truck onto the snow-covered shoreline ahead. I could see the outline of another truck beneath the surface, a mirror image of my own vehicle, traveling the same path, but somehow existing below the solid ice. The underwater truck's headlights broke through. Not through the ice, the surface remained solid, unbroken, thick enough to support my weight. But the lights themselves emerged, rising above the ice level while remaining somehow connected to whatever was beneath. Two brilliant beams of light now shone upward from the lake's surface, illuminating my truck from below like spotlights. I radioed one final transmission as I reached the shore. Dispatch, I'm off the lake. The lights are still down there, but they've stopped following me. Whatever was under the ice, I think it's staying in the lake. The search and rescue team found my truck the next morning at the bottom of Whitehorse Lake, approximately 200 yards from the northern shore. According to their diving equipment, it had fallen through ice that measured exactly 12 feet thick, ice that structural engineers later confirmed should have been capable of supporting 3 times the weight of my loaded truck. The official report cited unexplained ice failure as the cause of the accident. But the divers who recovered my truck reported something interesting. My vehicle was found sitting upright on the lake bottom, headlights still functioning, as if it had been gently lowered into position rather than crashing through broken ice. They also found tire tracks in the sediment beneath my truck tracks that led away into the deepest part of the lake, following the same route I'd taken across the surface. The tracks were fresh, pressed into mud that should have been frozen solid in January, and they matched the tread pattern of the tires on my truck exactly. I don't cross frozen lakes anymore. Can't trust what might be traveling the same routes beneath the ice. Can't shake the feeling that some journeys are made by vehicles that follow roads deeper than the ones we drive on the surface. Sometimes, on clear winter nights near Whitehorse Lake, local drivers report seeing lights moving beneath the ice headlights that follow the old shortcut route, rising toward the surface, but never quite breaking through. The elders say those lights have been there longer than anyone remembers. Travelers from times when the lake held different stories, different dangers. They warn that some routes run deeper than the ice, and the vehicles that follow those underwater roads are always looking for company on the journey to wherever it is they're going. The most terrifying sound in the world is your own obituary, being read by people who haven't realized you're still listening. My name is Marie-Claire Dubois, and I've been driving freight across northern Quebec for 18 years. I grew up in Chibougamau, a mining town where French was the first language and English was something you learned for dealing with government paperwork and southern customers. When I started trucking, I found comfort in the bilingual nature of the CB radio community drivers, switching effortlessly between French and English depending on who was listening, creating a sense of extended family across the vast distances of the Quebec wilderness. The James Bay Winter Road is a seasonal lifeline connecting the isolated communities along the eastern shore of James Bay to the southern road network. For 4 months each year, from January through April, it exists as a packed snow and ice highway running 600 kilometers through some of the most remote territory in North America. The road serves the Cree communities of Chisasibi, Wiminji, and East Main, carrying everything from food and fuel to construction materials and medical supplies that sustain these northern settlements through the long winter months. I specialized in the James Bay Run, making the journey twice a week during the winter road season. My reputation was built on reliability, 18 years without a major accident. Always on schedule, always professional in my radio communications. The northern communities depended on drivers like me, and I took that responsibility seriously. My truck was a red Peterbilt that other drivers recognized by sight, and my radio handle was Rouge du Nord, red from the north, a name that had stuck since my early days on the route. The CB radio was more than just communication equipment on the James Bay Winter Road. It was a social network, an early warning system, and often the only human contact during the long hours of driving through endless boreal forest. We shared weather updates, road conditions, jokes, and personal news. The French-speaking drivers formed a particularly close community, often chatting about families, local news from our hometowns, and the small details that made the isolation bearable. On February 16th, 2023, I was hauling medical supplies and pharmacy inventory to the health center in Chisasibi, a routine run I'd made hundreds of times over the years. The cargo was particularly important insulin for diabetic community members, antibiotics for a respiratory outbreak, and specialized equipment that had been delayed by weather for 2 weeks. The community was counting on this delivery, and I was making good time despite challenging road conditions. About 200 kilometers north of Matagami, I began picking up CB chatter in French from drivers I didn't recognize. Nothing unusual about that new drivers joined the winter road network every season, and the isolated nature of the work attracted people from all over Quebec. But something about the conversation pattern bothered me. They were speaking in the respectful, subdued tones usually reserved for serious news or bad weather warnings. "Such a shame about Marie Claire," one voice said in Quebec French. 18 years on these roads without incident, and then something like this happens. "The family is holding the service in Chibougamau next Tuesday," another replied. Her sister asked me to pass along the details to anyone who knew her on the James Bay route. I keyed my microphone immediately. "Excuse me, this is Marie Claire Dubois. I think there's been some confusion. I'm alive and well, currently northbound to Chisasibi." Silence on the channel. Then the conversation resumed, as if I hadn't spoken. "The worst part is, they haven't found her truck yet. Rouge du Nord, that red Peterbilt she was so proud of. The search teams are still looking, but with weather conditions like this. The police said she was carrying medical supplies when it happened. The community really needed those medicines too. Such a tragedy all around." My hands were shaking as I tried to transmit again. "This is Marie Claire Dubois. Call sign Rouge du Nord. Truck number 476. I'm listening to your conversation, and there's been a serious mistake." No response. They continued discussing my disappearance as if I wasn't there. The details they shared were accurate in ways that made my skin crawl. They knew about my cargo, the insulin and antibiotics that weren't listed on my public manifest. They knew about my route, my schedule, even the fact that I'd stopped for coffee in Matagami at 7:15 that morning and had complained to the cashier about the price of diesel fuel. Most unsettling, they knew personal details that I'd never shared over the radio. They mentioned that I'd been planning to retire after this season, something I'd only decided the previous week and hadn't told anyone except my sister. They knew about my cat, Minou, who had been sick and required daily medication that I administered every morning before leaving for work. "The funeral mass will be at St. Anne Church," the first voice continued. "Father Gagnon is officiating. He said he knew Marie Claire since she was a child, back when her father worked at the mine." This was true. Father Gagnon had baptized me, and my father had indeed worked at the Copper Rand mine until it closed in 1997. But these weren't facts I'd ever discussed on the CB radio. They were personal history, family details known only to people in Chibougamau. As the kilometers passed, the conversation evolved into the kind of detailed memorial discussion that follows the death of someone well known in a small community. They talked about my years of service to the northern communities, my reputation for reliability, the times I'd helped stranded drivers or delivered emergency supplies during severe weather. They shared stories. I recognized incidents from my own experience, but told from the perspective of people remembering someone who was gone. Remember that time she drove straight through a blizzard to get insulin to that diabetic child in East Maine? One voice said. The kid's mother still talks about how Marie Claire saved her son's life. That incident had happened 3 years ago, but I'd never discussed it on the radio. It was a private moment of professional pride, not something I advertised. Yet somehow these voices knew about it, along with dozens of other details from my career and personal life. The most disturbing aspect was how normal they sounded. These weren't ghostly voices or supernatural transmissions. They were ordinary truckers, having an ordinary conversation about a colleague who had died. Their French was natural, their accents familiar, their expressions of sympathy genuine. If I hadn't been listening to them discuss my own death, it would have been just another CB conversation on a long winter drive. Around kilometer marker 300, the nature of their discussion changed. They began talking about the circumstances of my disappearance, with details that sent ice through my veins. The last transmission, from Rouge du Nord, came at kilometer marker 320, one voice reported. She radioed about unusual ice conditions on Opanaka Lake, said she was going to take the alternate route around the eastern shore. I was approaching kilometer marker 310. Opanaka Lake was visible ahead of me through the snow, and I could see that the usual crossing route looked questionable. The ice surface showed stress patterns that suggested instability. I had indeed been planning to take the alternate route, though I hadn't radioed anyone about it yet. The search teams found evidence of a truck going through the ice at the normal crossing point, another voice continued. Looks like she tried the direct route despite the warning signs. Classic mistake. Experienced drivers sometimes get overconfident about ice conditions. But I was taking the alternate route. I was being careful, following proper winter driving protocols, avoiding the risky direct crossing. Yet somehow these future voices knew that I would make a different choice, a fatal choice, that would lead to my truck breaking through unstable ice. Radio logs show she tried to transmit a mayday call, the first voice said. Something about seeing lights under the ice. Other vehicles down there with her. Poor Marie Claire. Hypothermia must have been affecting her judgment by then. As they spoke, I noticed lights beneath the ice surface of Opanaka Lake, faint but clearly visible, like vehicle headlights shining up through the frozen water. The sight was so unexpected that I slowed down, trying to process what I was seeing. The lights seemed to be moving in patterns, following routes across the lakebed like traffic on an underwater highway. Without thinking, I reached for my CB microphone. Breaker 19. This is Rouge du Nord. I'm seeing vehicle lights under the ice at Opanaka Lake. Has anyone else reported this phenomenon? The voices from the future responded immediately. There it is, one said with sad recognition. Her final transmission. Poor Marie Claire. She's starting to see things now. The cold affects people differently. We should have told her to stay on the main road, another replied. If only we'd known. I realized with growing horror that I was hearing my own future, listening to the CB conversations that would happen after my death. These drivers weren't discussing a death that had already occurred. They were discussing a death that was going to occur, and somehow I was able to hear their future discussions in the present moment. The voices continued their memorial conversation as I drove the alternate route around Opanaka Lake, avoiding the dangerous direct crossing. But I could feel the inevitability of their words, the weight of a future that seemed fixed despite my attempts to change course. They spoke with the certainty of people remembering events that had already happened, even though those events were still in my future. I completed the delivery to Chisasibi without incident, unloaded the medical supplies, and began the return journey south. But throughout the trip, the voices continued their discussions of my death, my funeral, and the impact of my disappearance on the community. They never acknowledged my transmissions, never showed any awareness that I was listening to their conversations about my own demise. I still drive the James Bay Winter Road, though I've never again heard the voices discussing my funeral. Sometimes I wonder if I somehow avoided the fate they described, or if I'm still caught in the moments before it happens, eternally listening to conversations about a death that's always approaching but never quite arrives. The most unsettling possibility is that I did die at Opanaka Lake that night, and everything since then has been the experience of someone who doesn't yet realize they're gone. The CB radio in my truck occasionally picks up transmissions in French, drivers discussing routes and weather, and the small details of life on the winter roads. But I listen carefully now, afraid that someday I'll hear my own voice among them, discussing the disappearance of another driver who doesn't know yet that they're already gone. Time moves differently when you're being weighed by people who speak in mathematics instead of words, and the scale measures more than just your cargo. My name is Derek McLeod, though everyone calls me Moose, and I've been hauling freight to remote mining operations across the Northwest Territories for 17 years. I earned my nickname from my size, 6'4", 260 pounds, but kept it because of my reputation for navigating the most challenging northern routes with the reliability of a migrating animal. I knew every ice road, every winter access route, every seasonal bridge and bypass from Yellowknife to the Arctic Ocean. The run to Snap Lake Mine was one of my specialties, a challenging route that required precise timing and intimate knowledge of seasonal road conditions. The mine sat about 220 kilometers northeast of Yellowknife, accessible only by ice roads during the winter months when the lakes and rivers froze solid enough to support heavy freight traffic. Most drivers avoided the Snap Lake run because of the technical demands and the isolation. If your truck broke down out there, you might wait days for rescue in temperatures that could kill you within hours. I made the Snap Lake run twice a week during the winter road season, carrying everything from mining equipment to food supplies for the workers stationed at the remote operation. The route required crossing 14 different bodies of water, following a carefully mapped path that changed slightly each year based on ice conditions and environmental factors. I knew every kilometer marker, every potential hazard, every safe stopping point along the way. My truck was a modified Kenworth, specifically equipped for extreme northern conditions, with redundant heating systems, survival gear, and communication equipment that could reach emergency services even from the most remote locations. The cab was configured for solo long-haul work, with a sleeper berth, cooking facilities, and entertainment systems that made the isolation bearable during the long hours of driving through endless winter wilderness. On March 3rd, 2023, I was returning empty from Snap Lake Mine after delivering a load of replacement parts for their ore processing equipment. The return journey was typically straightforward. An empty truck handles better on ice roads, and the reduced weight meant I could maintain higher speeds on sections where loaded trucks had to proceed cautiously. The weather was clear, temperature holding at -32 degrees, and I was making excellent time on roads that were in perfect condition for the late winter season. About 90 kilometers southwest of the mine, I encountered a way station that shouldn't have existed. It appeared exactly where it should have, if weight enforcement was conducted on remote ice roads, which it never was. The facility looked official, with the standard configuration of approach lanes, scale platforms, and an inspection building that matched government specifications. 2 uniformed officers directed me onto the scales, with the professional gestures I'd seen hundreds of times at legitimate way stations throughout Canada. But something felt immediately wrong. The location was impossible. There were no permanent structures along this route, no power lines or communication infrastructure that could support a way station. The building looked new, as if it had been constructed recently, But the ice road only existed for 4 months each year. There wouldn't be time to build and remove such a facility every season. The senior officer approached my cab with the standard clipboard and professional demeanor I expected from weight enforcement personnel. He appeared to be in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, wearing a winter uniform that looked official but somehow unfamiliar in its details. "Good afternoon, Mr. McLeod," he said, though I hadn't shown him my license yet. "Routine weight inspection. Please remain in your cab while we conduct the measurement." I handed over my logbook and registration, noting that he'd used my name without checking my documentation first. The second officer, younger and more nervous looking, began what appeared to be a standard pre-inspection routine, walking around my truck and trailer, checking tire condition, examining safety equipment, taking notes on his own clipboard. The scale reading appeared on a digital display, visible through my windshield, 80,000 pounds. My empty truck and trailer weighed approximately 32,000 pounds. Even with a full fuel load and all my equipment, I'd never seen a scale reading above 35,000 when running empty. 80,000 pounds was the maximum legal weight for a loaded combination vehicle, the weight I would carry when hauling a full cargo load. "There must be an error with your scale," I told the senior officer. "I'm running empty. There's no way I could weigh 80,000 pounds. He consulted his clipboard, making notes in what appeared to be a standard enforcement documentation process. But when he spoke, his words sounded strange, not accented English, but something that resembled language without quite being recognizable as any language I'd ever heard. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, though the sounds he made didn't quite match the meaning I somehow understood. "Your cargo manifest shows full compliance with regulations." "I don't have a cargo manifest. I'm running empty back to Yellowknife." The younger officer joined the conversation, speaking in the same strange, not quite language that I nonetheless understood perfectly. "Sir, your load securement appears adequate, and the weight distribution falls within acceptable parameters. We'll need to conduct a detailed inspection of your cargo compartment." They spent 45 minutes examining my empty trailer, opening doors to reveal nothing but bare metal walls and unused tie-down equipment. But they proceeded with the methodical thoroughness of inspectors, examining actual cargo, checking imaginary load-securing devices, measuring the positions of freight that wasn't there, taking notes on the condition of goods that didn't exist. The most unsettling aspect was how normal their behavior seemed within the context of their impossible task. They worked with the professional competence of experienced enforcement officers, following standard procedures for inspecting cargo that only they could see. Their movements were precise, their documentation thorough, their interactions with each other conducted in the efficient manner of people who had performed these same duties many times before. During the inspection, I noticed details about the weigh station that should have raised immediate concerns. The building had no visible power source, no telephone lines, no communication equipment that would allow the officers to contact their headquarters or verify information in their databases. The scale platform appeared to be functioning perfectly, despite having no apparent connection to electrical infrastructure. Most disturbing was the language they used when speaking to each other. It wasn't English, French, or any indigenous language I'd encountered in my years of working with northern communities. The sounds they made formed patterns that felt like language, and somehow I understood their meaning. But the words themselves were unlike anything in human speech. "His documentation shows completion of required training modules," the senior officer said to his colleague, though the sounds that came from his mouth bore no resemblance to those English words. "Load manifest indicates priority classification for time-sensitive delivery," the younger officer replied, examining papers that showed only my standard empty truck documentation. They completed their inspection with the same professional efficiency they'd maintained throughout the process. Both officers shook my hand, wished me safe travels, and handed me a receipt for the weight inspection standard procedure that I'd experienced countless times at legitimate facilities. "Drive carefully, Mr. McLeod," the senior officer said. "Weather conditions can change rapidly in this region." I drove away from the way station feeling profoundly unsettled, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. The officers had been professional. Their procedures had seemed standard, and they'd found no violations or problems with my vehicle. But the experience felt fundamentally wrong in ways that went beyond the impossible location or the inexplicable scale reading. It wasn't until I reached Yellowknife, 6 hours later, that I began to understand the scope of what had happened. The return journey from Snap Lake Mine typically took 3 hours. I'd lost half a day somewhere along a route I'd driven hundreds of times, during what should have been a straightforward trip on roads I knew better than my own neighborhood. When I checked my GPS tracking system, the data showed that I'd never deviated from my planned route. According to the electronic records, I'd driven directly from the mine to Yellowknife, in exactly the time the journey should have taken. There was no record of stops, no indication of reduced speed, no evidence that I'd spent 45 minutes at a way station that couldn't exist. But I still had the inspection receipt. The paper was real, the official letterhead looked authentic, and the serial numbers appeared to follow standard government formatting. When I tried to verify the inspection with provincial authorities, however, they had no record of the serial numbers, no documentation of a way station at that location, and no knowledge of the officers who had signed the paperwork. I don't drive the Snap Lake route anymore. Can't trust what might be measuring weight and cargo that exists in dimensions I can't perceive. Can't shake the feeling that some inspections examine more than just the physical freight we carry. Sometimes I wonder what those officers saw when they looked into my empty trailer. What cargo manifest they were reading that showed contents I couldn't see. The most unsettling part isn't the lost time or the impossible weight reading. It's the growing certainty that I passed inspection for carrying something I wasn't aware I was hauling. Something that weighed exactly what it needed to weigh to meet regulations I don't understand, enforced by officials who speak in languages that exist only at the place where our world intersects with somewhere else entirely. The most terrifying sound in the world is your own obituary, being read by people who haven't realized you're still listening. My name is Marie-Claire Dubois, and I've been driving freight across northern Quebec for 18 years. I grew up in Chibougamau, a mining town where French was the first language and English was something you learned for dealing with government paperwork and southern customers. When I started trucking, I found comfort in the bilingual nature of the CB radio community drivers, switching effortlessly between French and English depending on who was listening, creating a sense of extended family across the vast distances of the Quebec wilderness. The James Bay Winter Road is a seasonal lifeline, connecting the isolated communities along the eastern shore of James Bay to the Southern Road Network. For 4 months each year, from January through April, it exists as a packed snow and ice highway running 600 kilometers through some of the most remote territory in North America. The road serves the Cree communities of Chisasibi, Wiminji, and East Main, carrying everything from food and fuel to construction materials and medical supplies that sustain these northern settlements through the long winter months. I specialized in the James Bay Run, making the journey twice a week during the winter road season. My reputation was built on reliability, 18 years without a major accident. Always on schedule, always professional in my radio communications. The northern communities depended on drivers like me, and I took that responsibility seriously. My truck was a red Peterbilt that other drivers recognized by sight, and my radio handle was Rouge du Nord, red from the north, a name that had stuck since my early days on the route. The CB radio was more than just communication equipment on the James Bay Winter Road. It was a social network, an early warning system, and often the only human contact during the long hours of driving through endless boreal forest. We shared weather updates, road conditions, jokes, and personal news. The French-speaking drivers formed a particularly close community, often chatting about families, local news from our hometowns, and the small details that made the isolation bearable. On February 16th, 2023, I was hauling medical supplies and pharmacy inventory to the health center in Chisasibi, a routine run I'd made hundreds of times over the years. The cargo was particularly important insulin for diabetic community members, antibiotics for a respiratory outbreak, and specialized equipment that had been delayed by weather for 2 weeks. The community was counting on this delivery, and I was making good time despite challenging road conditions. About 200 kilometers north of Matagami, I began picking up CB chatter in French from drivers I didn't recognize. Nothing unusual about that new drivers join the winter road network every season, and the isolated nature of the work attracted people from all over Quebec. But something about the conversation pattern bothered me. They were speaking in the respectful, subdued tones usually reserved for serious news or bad weather warnings. Such a shame about Marie-Claire, one voice said in Quebec French. 18 years on these roads without incident, and then something like this happens. The family is holding the service in Chibougamau next Tuesday, another replied. Her sister asked me to pass along the details to anyone who knew her on the James Bay route. I keyed my microphone immediately. Excuse me, this is Marie-Claire Dubois. I think there's been some confusion. I'm alive and well, currently northbound to Chisasibi. Silence on the channel. Then the conversation resumed, as if I hadn't spoken. The worst part is, they haven't found her truck yet. Rouge du Nord, that red Peterbilt she was so proud of. The search teams are still looking, but with weather conditions like this. The police said she was carrying medical supplies when it happened. The community really needed those medicines too. Such a tragedy all around. My hands were shaking as I tried to transmit again. This is Marie-Claire Dubois. Call sign Rouge du Nord. Truck number 476. I'm listening to your conversation, and there's been a serious mistake. No response. They continued discussing my disappearance as if I wasn't there. The details they shared were accurate in ways that made my skin crawl. They knew about my cargo, the insulin and antibiotics that weren't listed on my public manifest. They knew about my route, my schedule, even the fact that I'd stopped for coffee in Matagami at 7:15 that morning and had complained to the cashier about the price of diesel fuel. Most unsettling, they knew personal details that I'd never shared over the radio. They mentioned that I'd been planning to retire after this season, something I'd only decided the previous week and hadn't told anyone except my sister. They knew about my cat, Minou, who had been sick and required daily medication that I administered every morning before leaving for work. The funeral mass will be at St. Anne Church, the first voice continued. Father Gagnon is officiating. He said he knew Marie-Claire since she was a child, back when her father worked at the mine. This was true. Father Gagnon had baptized me, and my father had indeed worked at the Copper Rand mine until it closed in 1997. But these weren't facts I'd ever discussed on the CB radio. They were personal history, family details known only to people in Chibougamau. As the kilometers passed, the conversation evolved into the kind of detailed memorial discussion that follows the death of someone well known in a small community. They talked about my years of service to the northern communities, my reputation for reliability, the times I'd helped stranded drivers or delivered emergency supplies during severe weather. They shared stories. I recognized incidents from my own experience, but told from the perspective of people remembering someone who was gone. Remember that time she drove straight through a blizzard to get insulin to that diabetic child in East Maine? One voice said. The kid's mother still talks about how Marie-Claire saved her son's life. That incident had happened 3 years ago, but I'd never discussed it on the radio. It was a private moment of professional pride, not something I advertised. Yet somehow these voices knew about it, along with dozens of other details from my career and personal life. The most disturbing aspect was how normal they sounded. These weren't ghostly voices or supernatural transmissions. They were ordinary truckers, having an ordinary conversation about a colleague who had died. Their French was natural, their accents familiar, their expressions of sympathy genuine. If I hadn't been listening to them discuss my own death, it would have been just another CB conversation on a long winter drive. Around kilometer marker 300, the nature of their discussion changed. They began talking about the circumstances of my disappearance, with details that sent ice through my veins. The last transmission, from Rouge du Nord, came at kilometer marker 320, one voice reported. She radioed about unusual ice conditions on Opanaka Lake, said she was going to take the alternate route around the eastern shore. I was approaching kilometer marker 310. Opanaka Lake was visible ahead of me through the snow, and I could see that the usual crossing route looked questionable. The ice surface showed stress patterns that suggested instability. I had indeed been planning to take the alternate route, though I hadn't radioed anyone about it yet. The search teams found evidence of a truck going through the ice at the normal crossing point, another voice continued. Looks like she tried the direct route despite the warning signs. Classic mistake. Experienced drivers sometimes get overconfident about ice conditions. But I was taking the alternate route. I was being careful, following proper winter driving protocols, avoiding the risky direct crossing. Yet somehow these future voices knew that I would make a different choice, a fatal choice, that would lead to my truck breaking through unstable ice. Radio logs show she tried to transmit a mayday call, the first voice said. Something about seeing lights under the ice. Other vehicles down there with her. Poor Marie Claire. Hypothermia must have been affecting her judgment by then. As they spoke, I noticed lights beneath the ice surface of Opanaka Lake, faint but clearly visible, like vehicle headlights shining up through the frozen water. The sight was so unexpected that I slowed down, trying to process what I was seeing. The lights seemed to be moving in patterns, following routes across the lakebed like traffic on an underwater highway. Without thinking, I reached for my CB microphone. Breaker 19. This is Rouge du Nord. I'm seeing vehicle lights under the ice at Opanaka Lake. Has anyone else reported this phenomenon? The voices from the future responded immediately. There it is, one said with sad recognition. Her final transmission. Poor Marie Claire. She's starting to see things now. The cold affects people differently. We should have told her to stay on the main road, another replied. If only we'd known. I realized with growing horror that I was hearing my own future, listening to the CB conversations that would happen after my death. These drivers weren't discussing a death that had already occurred. They were discussing a death that was going to occur, and somehow I was able to hear their future discussions in the present moment. The voices continued their memorial conversation as I drove the alternate route around Opanaka Lake, avoiding the dangerous direct crossing. But I could feel the inevitability of their words, the weight of a future that seemed fixed despite my attempts to change course. They spoke with the certainty of people remembering events that had already happened, even though those events were still in my future. I completed the delivery to Chisasibi without incident, unloaded the medical supplies, and began the return journey south. But throughout the trip, the voices continued their discussions of my death, my funeral, and the impact of my disappearance on the community. They never acknowledged my transmissions, never showed any awareness that I was listening to their conversations about my own demise. I still drive the James Bay Winter Road, though I've never again heard the voices discussing my funeral. Sometimes I wonder if I somehow avoided the fate they described, or if I'm still caught in the moments before it happens, eternally listening to conversations about a death that's always approaching but never quite arrives. The most unsettling possibility is that I did die at Opanaka Lake that night, and everything since then has been the experience of someone who doesn't yet realize they're gone. The CB radio in my truck occasionally picks up transmissions in French, drivers discussing routes and weather, and the small details of life on the winter roads. But I listen carefully now, afraid that someday I'll hear my own voice among them, discussing the disappearance of another driver who doesn't know yet that they're already gone. Distance becomes meaningless when the mile markers start counting down to zero, and you realize there's something waiting for you in the negative numbers. My name is Frank Kosolov, and I've been hauling freight across northern Ontario for 23 years without a single accident, citation, or late delivery on my record. I started driving when GPS was expensive, optional equipment, and navigation meant reading paper maps by dome light, calculating fuel stops with a pencil, and knowing every mile marker, rest area, and alternate route by memory. The winter logging roads were my specialty seasonal routes that existed only when the ground froze solid enough to support loaded trucks, connecting remote timber operations to processing facilities hundreds of kilometers away. The road to Red Lake was one of my regular routes during the logging season. A 140-kilometer stretch of packed snow and ice that cut through some of the most isolated forest in Ontario. The road was marked with standard mile markers, starting from the highway connection and counting up to the logging camps around Red Lake. I knew every marker along that route, could tell you what the terrain looked like at marker 37, where the best place to turn around was near marker 92, which sections got rough in late season around markers 60 through 70. My truck was a silver Peterbilt, configured for heavy logging equipment transport, with chains, safety equipment, and communication gear appropriate for working in remote areas where breakdowns could be fatal during the brutal northern winters. I'd been running loads of replacement parts and supplies to the Red Lake logging operation twice a week since the season opened in early January, following the same route, hitting the same timing marks, maintaining the same professional standards that had kept me employed and alive for over 2 decades. On March 14, 2024, I was hauling hydraulic components and chainsaw parts to the main logging camp, a routine delivery that should have taken 4 hours from pickup to delivery. The weather was clear, temperature holding at minus 26 degrees, and the road conditions were excellent despite being late in the season. I'd made this same run the previous Tuesday with no complications, and I was expecting another straightforward delivery. The first 30 miles proceeded normally. Mile markers appeared at regular intervals, counting upward from the highway connection toward Red Lake. Marker 5 passed on schedule. Marker 10 looked exactly as it should. Marker 15 appeared where I expected it. Everything was routine, familiar, exactly as it had been on dozens of previous runs. At mile marker 23, something changed. The next marker I passed read 22, then 21. The markers were counting backward, indicating I was moving away from Red Lake despite driving forward on the correct route at normal speed. I checked my compass, verified my GPS position, examined my surroundings for familiar landmarks. Everything confirmed I was traveling in the right direction on the correct road, but the mile markers suggested I was moving backward along the route. I radioed my dispatcher to report the unusual situation. "Base, this is Frank. I'm seeing some kind of marker problem on the Red Lake Road. The mile markers are counting backward, even though I'm driving toward the destination." "Copy that, Frank. Are you sure you're on the correct route?" "Positive on route confirmation. GPS shows normal forward progress, but the physical markers are reading in reverse sequence." The dispatcher seemed unconcerned. Mile marker vandalism or maintenance errors weren't unheard of on remote logging roads. But as I continued driving, the backward countdown continued with mathematical precision. Marker 2019, 18, each appearing exactly where the forward counting markers should have been, but displaying numbers that suggested I was retreating from my destination. By marker 15, I was genuinely concerned. This wasn't random vandalism or isolated maintenance error. Every marker was wrong, all showing the reverse sequence in perfect order. I'd been driving forward for an hour, covering approximately 60 kilometers according to my odometer and GPS, but the mile markers indicated I'd somehow traveled backward to a position closer to the highway than when I'd started. "Base, the situation is getting worse. I'm now seeing mile marker 12, but according to my instruments, I should be approaching marker 60. Something's seriously wrong with the road markers, or my equipment. Frank, your GPS transponder is showing normal forward progress on the Red Lake route. You're making good time toward your destination. Are you feeling all right? I felt fine physically, alert and focused, despite the growing confusion about my location. My truck was running normally, the road surface was good, and the forest around me looked exactly as it should during a standard run to Red Lake. Only the mile markers contradicted the evidence of my other navigation systems. At mile marker 10, I stopped to examine the sign closely. It was a standard highway department marker, properly installed and maintained, showing no signs of alteration or replacement. The number 10 was clearly displayed in official font and formatting, exactly matching the other markers I'd seen throughout my career. But according to every other indicator I had, this marker should have read 70 or higher. I continued driving, watching the impossible countdown continue. Marker 9, 8, 7, each appearing in sequence as if the entire road numbering system had been reversed. My GPS continued showing forward progress toward Red Lake. My compass confirmed the correct heading, and my fuel consumption indicated normal travel time and distance. Only the physical mile markers suggested something impossible was happening. Base. I'm now passing mile marker 5. This doesn't make sense. According to the markers, I'm almost back at the highway, but according to GPS, I'm nearly at Red Lake. Frank, your position shows normal approach to destination. Estimated arrival in 40 minutes. Are the mile markers the only navigation issue you're experiencing? They were. Everything else indicated normal, forward travel on a familiar route. But the mile markers continued their backward countdown with unwavering consistency, creating a growing sense that I was traveling through landscape that followed different rules than the ones I'd learned to trust over 23 years of professional driving. Mile marker 4 passed, then 3, then 2. I was approaching marker 1 despite having driven forward for over 3 hours on a route that should have taken me deep into the forest toward Red Lake. According to the markers, I was about to reach the beginning of the road, the point where the logging route connected to the highway, but I could see dense forest ahead of me, not the highway intersection that marker 1 should have indicated. Mile marker 1 appeared exactly where it should have, according to the backward sequence, but instead of the highway connection I expected, the road continued straight ahead into forest that looked deeper and more remote than anything I'd seen on previous runs. My GPS showed I was in the correct position for final approach to Red Lake, but the landscape suggested I was entering territory I'd never seen before. Base, I just passed mile marker 1, but the road keeps going. There should be a highway intersection here, but I'm still in deep forest. GPS shows normal position, but the visual doesn't match. Frank, GPS shows you're 5 kilometers from Red Lake logging camp. You should be arriving any minute. The next marker I passed read 0. Mile marker 0 appeared at a position where no marker should have existed. The logging road had always been numbered, starting from 1 at the highway connection and counting up to the final markers near Red Lake. There had never been a marker 0 in the 23 years I'd been driving this route, but there it stood, clearly marked with the number 0 in standard highway department formatting. Beyond mile marker 0, the road continued into forest that looked increasingly unfamiliar. The trees were taller than I remembered, the spacing between them different, the quality of light filtering through the canopy strange in ways I couldn't articulate. My GPS insisted I was approaching Red Lake, but the landscape suggested I was entering territory that existed beyond the boundaries of mapped geography. Base, I've just passed mile marker 0. The road continues, but I'm entering area that's not on my maps. GPS still shows approach to destination, but visual confirmation doesn't match expected terrain. Frank? Say again? Did you say mile marker 0? Affirmative. Mile marker 0. The road continues beyond it, but I'm in forest that doesn't match the Red Lake area, requesting guidance on whether to continue or turn back. The radio crackled with static, then cleared. Frank, there is no mile marker 0 on the Red Lake Road. Are you sure about what you're seeing? Ahead of me, the next marker appeared. Mile marker -1. I'd entered negative distance on a road that apparently extended beyond the 0 point into numbered territory that couldn't exist according to standard mapping systems. The marker was professionally installed and properly maintained, displaying 1 in the same font and format as all the previous markers. Beyond it, the road continued into forest that seemed to follow different seasonal patterns. The snow looked deeper. The ice on the branches had formations I'd never seen in 23 years of winter driving. Base. I'm now at mile marker -1. The road extends into negative distance. My GPS has stopped updating position. I'm in unmapped territory. Static. No response from dispatch. Mile marker -2 appeared ahead of me, then -3. I was driving deeper into distance that measured itself in numbers below 0, following a road that led to destinations not included in any GPS database or logging company map. The forest around me was changing, becoming something that belonged to regions where different rules applied to navigation, distance, and the relationship between traveling forward and arriving somewhere else. I never reached the Red Lake logging camp, though according to some GPS systems, I arrived exactly on schedule. My truck was found the next morning in the Red Lake camp parking area, cargo properly delivered, with a completed delivery receipt signed in my handwriting. But I have no memory of completing that delivery, and the logging camp supervisor insists he never saw me or my truck. I don't drive the Red Lake Road anymore. Can't trust mile markers that count in directions that lead beyond mapped territory. Can't shake the feeling that some roads extend into negative distance where the destinations aren't the places you intended to reach. Sometimes I wonder if I ever returned from mile marker -3, or if I'm still driving forward on a road that measures distance in numbers that decrease beyond 0, following markers that count down to destinations that exist in the spaces between where you are and where you think you're going. The most unsettling thing about serving coffee to ghosts is realizing they know everything you said yesterday, and they're eager to continue conversations you thought were private. My name is Angela Morrison, though most drivers know me as Red because of my auburn hair that stands out in a profession dominated by men. I've been driving long-haul freight across North America for 19 years, specializing in the southern routes that keep you moving through populated areas with reliable truck stops, good communication coverage, and predictable road conditions. But winter work pays better, and at 41, I was ready to challenge myself with the seasonal routes across northern Ontario and Manitoba that most drivers consider too risky or too isolated. The truck stop in Wawa, Ontario, was a mandatory fuel and rest stop for anyone running freight between Thunder Bay and the northern communities during ice road season. Located at the intersection of the Trans-Canada Highway and the winter access roads, it served as the last major facility before drivers committed to hundreds of kilometers of wilderness driving on routes that existed only when the ground froze solid enough to support heavy trucks. I'd stopped at the Wawa truck stop dozens of times over the years during my southern runs, but never during winter season when it served as a staging area for the ice road drivers. The facility was larger than I remembered. The restaurant had been expanded, the fuel bays upgraded, and the parking area extended to accommodate the increased traffic from winter freight operations. During ice road season, it operated 24 hours a day, providing services and community for drivers tackling some of the most challenging routes in North America. On February 19, 2023, I pulled into Wawa for fuel and a meal break during my first ice road delivery run. I was hauling medical supplies and communications equipment to the nursing stations in the remote communities north of Thunder Bay, a route that would test everything I'd learned about winter driving during my transition from southern long-haul work to northern specialty freight. The truck stop was busy, despite the late hour, nearly midnight, when I parked among the other big rigs and made my way into the restaurant. The atmosphere was different from the southern truck stops I knew, more serious and focused, with drivers sharing information about road conditions, weather updates, and the practical details that could mean the difference between successful delivery and getting stranded in life-threatening conditions. I ordered coffee and a sandwich from the night staff, planning to eat quickly and get back on the road while conditions remained stable. But as I looked for an empty table, I heard a voice calling my name from across the restaurant. "Red, over here, we saved you a seat." A group of 3 drivers at a corner booth were waving me over, all wearing the heavy winter gear and weather-beaten expressions of experienced ice road specialists. I recognized the camaraderie typical of the trucking community, but couldn't place any of their faces from my years of southern route driving. I approached their table with the usual professional courtesy, introducing myself and explaining that I was new to the ice road routes. But their response suggested they already knew far more about me than strangers should have. "Angela Morrison, right?" said the older driver, a bearded man who looked like he'd been running northern routes for decades. "We heard you had that dispatcher trouble yesterday. That guy from the Thunder Bay office giving you grief about your delivery schedule." This stopped me cold. I had indeed had a frustrating conversation with my dispatcher the previous day, but it had been a private phone call from my truck cab, parked at a rest area with no other vehicles around. The conversation had involved scheduling conflicts and route changes that weren't public information, details that only the dispatcher and I should have known. "How did you know about that?" I asked, settling into the booth seat they'd indicated. "Word gets around," said the second driver, a younger woman with the confident manner of someone who'd earned respect in a demanding profession. "You handled it well, telling him that winter routes require flexibility and that southern dispatchers don't understand ice road timing." She was quoting me almost verbatim. Those were the exact words I'd used during yesterday's phone conversation, a private argument that had frustrated me enough that I'd spent the rest of the day thinking about it. But I'd never discussed it with anyone else, hadn't mentioned it on CB radio, and certainly hadn't shared those specific words with other drivers. "I don't remember talking to anyone about that conversation," I said carefully. "Coffee's getting cold," said the third driver, sliding a full mug across the table toward me. "We ordered you the usual black, 2 sugars. I drank black coffee, no sugar. I'd never ordered coffee any other way in my 19 years of truck stop dining. But when I tasted the coffee they'd ordered for me, it was exactly how I liked it. Black, strong, with a slight bitter edge that reminded me of truck stop coffee from my early driving days." The conversation continued with the same unsettling pattern. They knew details about my route, my cargo, my truck specifications, and my personal driving habits that they couldn't have learned through normal trucking community information sharing. They mentioned the radio call I'd made to my sister 2 days ago, including specific details about our conversation that no one else could have overheard. They knew about the mechanical problem I'd developed with my air conditioning system, the name of the mechanic who'd fixed it, and the exact amount I'd paid for the repair. Most disturbing was their familiarity with my thoughts and concerns about transitioning to winter work. They discussed my worries about ice road driving, my financial motivations for taking on the challenging routes, and my long-term career plans, with the intimate knowledge of people who had shared those conversations with me. But I'd never discussed those personal matters with other drivers. They were private concerns I'd only explored in my own mind. "The thing about winter driving," the older driver said, stirring sugar into coffee that looked exactly like the blend I preferred, "is that it changes how you think about distance and time. Up here, yesterday's conversations have a way of following you to today's truck stops." "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "Information travels differently in the cold," the woman driver explained. "Things you said yesterday might not reach the right ears until today. Conversations get frozen in transit, then thaw out when you least expect them." This sounded like the kind of folklore that develops around challenging work environments, but their knowledge of my private conversations suggested something more literal than metaphorical. They were discussing specific details that could only have come from direct observation of my activities yet I was certain I'd never met any of them before. The restaurant around us was busy with normal truck stop activity drivers coming and going, waitresses serving meals, the usual late-night atmosphere of a facility that served people working irregular schedules. But something about the lighting and the background noise seemed slightly off, as if the normal sounds were being filtered through some medium that changed their quality. I excused myself to use the restroom, partly for normal reasons, but mainly to get a few minutes away from the unsettling conversation. In the bathroom mirror, I looked exactly as I should, tired from the long drive, slightly nervous about the challenging route ahead, but otherwise normal. When I returned to the dining area, the three drivers were gone. Their table was empty, with no sign they'd ever been there. No coffee cups, no plates, no indication that anyone had been sitting in that booth recently. The waitress cleaning nearby tables looked at me strangely when I asked about the three drivers who'd been sitting there. "Honey, you've been sitting alone at that table for the past hour," she said, talking up a storm, pouring coffee for empty chairs, but there hasn't been anyone else there. I checked my watch. According to the time, I'd been in the truck stop for over an hour, though it felt like I'd only been there for 15 or 20 minutes. My coffee mug was empty, with the stains and rings that indicated multiple refills. And there were 3 other mugs on the table that showed signs of use, despite the waitress's insistence that I'd been alone. "Did I really pour coffee for empty chairs?" I asked. "Well, you seemed to be having a good time with whoever you thought was there, laughing, nodding, really engaged in the conversation. We figured you were on a hands-free phone call or something, though you weren't wearing any kind of headset. I paid for my meal, and for 3 other meals that appeared on my bill, despite the waitress's claim that I'd been dining alone. The receipt itemized coffee and sandwiches for 4 people, with timestamps showing orders placed throughout the hour I'd apparently spent at the empty table. When I reached my truck and checked the security cameras that monitored the parking area, I could see footage of myself entering the restaurant, but the timestamp showed I'd been inside much longer than I remembered. There was no footage of the 3 drivers I'd spoken with, no record of other vehicles arriving or departing during the time I thought I was having conversations with fellow ice road specialists. I completed my delivery run without incident, but the experience at the Wawa truck stop left me profoundly unsettled. The knowledge those drivers had displayed about my private conversations and personal concerns seemed too specific and detailed to dismiss as coincidence or lucky guessing. Yet the physical evidence suggested I'd spent an hour talking to people who weren't there, pouring coffee for customers who existed only in my perception. I still stop at the Wawa truck stop when running northern routes, but I'm more careful about who I talk to in the restaurant. Sometimes I see drivers at corner booths who look familiar, who wave and call my name as if we've met before. But now I check their reflections in the windows, watch for their shadows on the floor, and pay attention to whether the waitresses acknowledge their presence before I sit down to continue conversations that apparently began yesterday and somehow followed me to today. Sometimes the land remembers what used to be there, and when it does, your truck will climb mountains that were moved away 1,000 years ago. My name is Benjamin Crowfeather, and I carry 2 kinds of knowledge about traveling across this territory. My grandmother taught me the traditional ways of reading the land, understanding the seasonal patterns and spiritual geography that guided our people's movements for generations before roads existed. My commercial driver's license and 15 years of trucking experience taught me the modern ways: GPS, navigation, weight distribution, engine management systems, and the mechanical principles that keep loaded trucks moving safely across challenging terrain. The seasonal road to God's Lake Narrows exists only during the deepest winter months, when the lakes and rivers freeze solid enough to support heavy freight traffic. It connects the First Nation community of God's Lake Narrows to the outside world for supplies that can't be flown in: construction materials, fuel deliveries, household goods that sustain the community through the long northern winter. The road follows traditional travel routes that my ancestors used for centuries, crossing the same lakes and rivers, following the same general direction across landscape that holds memory in its stones and trees. I specialized in the God's Lake Narrows run because I understood both the technical demands of winter driving and the cultural significance of maintaining that connection to the community. My truck was a modified Freightliner equipped for extreme cold conditions, but I also carried tobacco and traditional offerings for the spirits of the places I traveled through. My grandmother had taught me that some routes require both mechanical preparation and spiritual courtesy, that the land itself might choose whether to let you pass. The stretch of road where it happened was a section I'd driven dozens of times, a straight run across what the maps showed as relatively flat terrain between two frozen lakes. According to topographical surveys, the elevation varied by less than 50 feet over the entire 10-kilometer section. According to my GPS and altimeter readings, it was one of the easiest parts of the journey. No significant grades, no challenging turns, just a straight shot across frozen muskeg with good visibility and reliable surface conditions. On January 28, 2024, I was hauling building supplies and fuel to God's Lake Narrows, a delivery that would help the community complete construction projects that had been delayed by early winter weather. The load was heavy, but well within my truck's capacity, properly secured and balanced for winter road conditions. The weather was clear, temperature holding at minus 34 degrees, and the road conditions were excellent throughout the first half of my journey. When I reached the straight section between the two lakes, my truck began laboring as if I was climbing a steep hill. The engine RPMs increased automatically as the transmission downshifted to compensate for what it interpreted as a significant uphill grade. My coolant temperature gauge began climbing toward the overheating range, despite the extreme cold outside. The truck was working hard, consuming fuel at rates appropriate for mountain driving, struggling against what felt like a grade steep enough to challenge a fully loaded vehicle. But when I looked through my windshield, I saw perfectly flat terrain stretching ahead for kilometers. No hills, no inclines, nothing but level frozen ground that should have allowed my truck to maintain highway speeds with minimal engine effort. My altimeter readings showed that I was actually descending slightly, losing approximately 200 feet of elevation. Over the course of the 10-kilometer straight section, I pulled over to check my instruments and examine my truck for mechanical problems that might explain the engine strain. Everything tested normal. The transmission was functioning properly. The brakes weren't dragging. The tires showed no signs of unusual resistance. According to every diagnostic system I had, my truck was in perfect working condition on relatively easy terrain. But when I resumed driving, the engine strain continued. My truck crawled along at 15 kilometers per hour, working as hard as if I was climbing a mountain pass, while my altimeter confirmed I was descending gradually toward the second lake. The disconnect between what my engine was experiencing and what my instruments were measuring created a growing sense that I was traveling through landscape that followed different physical rules than the ones I understood. I radioed the community dispatcher to report the unusual conditions. God's Lake Base, this is Benjamin. I'm experiencing engine strain on the flat section between the lakes. Truck's working like I'm climbing a steep hill, but the terrain looks level. Copy that, Benjamin. Are you having mechanical problems? All systems test normal, but the engine's overheating from the load. It's like I'm driving up a mountain that I can't see. The dispatcher was familiar with both my technical competence and my traditional knowledge, understanding that my observations carried weight earned through years of experience on challenging routes. But the situation I was describing made no sense according to standard trucking logistics. Benjamin, your GPS transponder shows normal position and speed. No elevation changes significant enough to cause engine strain. I continued struggling across what appeared to be flat ground, my truck working harder with each kilometer despite the descending elevation readings. The engine temperature gauge crept into the danger zone, forcing me to stop every few kilometers to let the system cool down. During these stops, I would get out and examine the terrain around me, looking for visual clues that might explain what my truck was experiencing. The land looked exactly as it should, flat frozen muskeg dotted with small trees, clear sightlines in all directions. No geographical features that could account for the engine strain. But my grandmother had taught me that the land holds memory, that some places remember what they used to be before changes occurred. She had stories about this area, about mountains that had been moved by the spirits long before her grandmother's time, about routes that sometimes followed the old geography instead of the current landscape. Standing beside my overheating truck on terrain that looked perfectly flat, I began to understand what might be happening. My truck wasn't responding to the current topography, it was climbing a mountain that used to exist in this location, following gradients that belonged to an earlier version of the land's spiritual geography. I made an offering of tobacco to the spirits of the place, speaking in Cree as my grandmother had taught me, explaining my purpose and asking permission to continue the journey. Then I returned to my truck and attempted the crossing again, this time acknowledging the invisible mountain that my engine was trying to climb. The difference was immediate and profound. As soon as I recognized and respected the presence of the ancestral topography, my truck began climbing more efficiently. The engine strain remained, but it felt purposeful now. Rather than confused, my vehicle was working with the land's memory, instead of fighting against its current appearance. I drove the remaining distance in first gear, acknowledging the steep grade that existed in the spiritual geography of the place, while my altimeter readings continued to show gradual descent. My truck climbed steadily through what appeared to be flat terrain, working exactly as it should when ascending a mountain that could be felt but not seen. When I reached the second lake, the engine strain disappeared completely. My truck resumed normal operation as if nothing unusual had occurred. Cooling systems returned to normal temperatures, and fuel consumption dropped back to expected levels. According to my instruments, I had just descended 200 feet, while my engine had worked to climb what felt like a 1,000-foot mountain pass. I completed the delivery to God's Lake Narrows, and shared the experience with the community elders, who listened with the recognition of people who understood that some journeys require navigation of both current and ancestral geography. They confirmed what my grandmother had taught me, that certain routes follow paths through landscape that exists in multiple versions simultaneously, and that successful travel sometimes requires acknowledgement of geography that belongs to different times. I still drive the seasonal road to God's Lake Narrows, but I approach that straight section with different understanding now. I carry extra coolant and allow extra time for the climb that doesn't appear on any topographical map, but exists in the memory of the land itself. My truck works harder there, climbing mountains that were moved long before roads existed, navigating terrain that requires both mechanical competence and spiritual courtesy to traverse safely. The most unsettling aspect isn't the engine strain or the impossible grade. It's the realization that the land holds memory of what it used to be, and sometimes our modern navigation systems encounter geography that belongs to versions of the world that existed before we began mapping it with instruments that can only measure what currently appears to be there. The most terrifying warning signs are the ones that tell you about tomorrow's accidents while you're still trying to avoid today's hazards. My name is Klaus Zimmerman, and I approach trucking with the systematic precision that comes from 15 years as a civil engineer before I immigrated to Canada in 2012. I specialized in infrastructure analysis, road construction, traffic flow optimization, and hazard assessment for transportation systems. When I transitioned to commercial driving, I brought that analytical mindset to route planning, vehicle maintenance, and safety documentation that helped me build a reputation for reliability and attention to detail. The access road to Victor Diamond Mine in northern Ontario was a challenging route that required both technical driving skills and careful documentation of road conditions for safety reporting. The mine operation depended on regular freight deliveries of equipment, supplies, and personnel transport, but the remote location meant that road hazards could develop quickly and pose serious risks to drivers unfamiliar with the changing conditions. I made detailed photographic records of road conditions during each run to the Victor mine, documenting surface quality, weather impacts, and any hazards that might affect future deliveries. My engineering background made me particularly attentive to infrastructure details that other drivers might overlook: bridge stress indicators, shoulder erosion patterns, drainage problems that could lead to washouts or ice formation during different seasonal conditions. On March 7, 2023, I was hauling replacement parts for mining equipment to Victor Diamond Mine following the 130-kilometer access road that connected the mine to the main highway system. The cargo was time-sensitive. Critical components needed to repair extraction equipment that had failed during the previous week's operations. My delivery schedule allowed for careful driving and thorough documentation of road conditions that had changed significantly since the spring thaw began. About 60 kilometers into the journey, I encountered warning signs that displayed information I had never seen before. The first sign read, "Caution, bridge washout ahead. Alternate route required." Effective March 8, 2023. The date was tomorrow, one day in the future, from my current journey. According to my maps and previous experience on this route, there was no bridge washout ahead, and March 8th had not yet occurred. I stopped to photograph the sign, noting its official appearance and proper formatting. The typography, materials, and installation methods matched standard highway department specifications. But the effective date made no logical sense unless the sign had been posted in error or someone had made a clerical mistake when preparing the warning notices. As I continued toward the mine, more signs appeared with the same impossible dating pattern. Road surface deterioration, miles 65-67. Reduced speed limit 30 kph. March 8, 2023. Fallen tree obstruction, mile 72. Single lane traffic. March 8, 2023. Ice formation hazard, mile 78. Chains required. March 8, 2023. Each sign described hazards that I could not observe on the current road conditions. All dated for tomorrow. All positioned at locations where the warned conditions did not currently exist. My engineering training made me particularly sensitive to infrastructure documentation, and these signs violated every protocol for hazard reporting and warning sign deployment that I understood from my professional background. I photographed each sign systematically, recording GPS coordinates and timestamps to document the anomalous situation. The signs were real, properly manufactured and installed, displaying warnings about future conditions with the precision of advanced hazard planning that required accurate prediction of when and where problems would develop. At mile 65, where one sign warned of road surface deterioration effective tomorrow, the pavement was in excellent condition. At mile 72, where another sign warned of fallen tree obstruction, the roadway was clear, with healthy trees showing no signs of stress or instability. At mile 78, where a sign warned of ice formation hazard, the road surface was dry, with temperatures well above freezing. But the sign's specificity troubled me more than their impossible dating. They described exact locations, precise hazard types, and detailed mitigation measures with the accuracy of someone who had direct observation of conditions that did not yet exist. The engineering precision of the warnings suggested systematic analysis of problems that hadn't occurred yet. I completed my delivery to Victor Diamond Mine and reported the unusual signage to the site supervisor, sharing my photographs and GPS documentation. The mine's logistics coordinator was familiar with road conditions and infrastructure maintenance procedures, but had no knowledge of advance warning signs being posted for future hazards. Klaus, we coordinate with the Highway Department on all road maintenance and hazard reporting, he explained, examining my photographs. These signs weren't scheduled for installation, and we haven't received any advance notice of the conditions they're describing. The engineering appears sound, I replied. But the effective dates are impossible unless someone has perfect prediction capability for infrastructure failures. That evening, I reviewed my photographs and documentation, cross-referencing the warned locations with my maps and previous condition reports. The signs described a sequence of hazards that, if they occurred as predicted, would create a challenging but navigable route requiring specific mitigation strategies: alternate routing for the bridge washout, reduced speed for surface deterioration, single-lane procedures for tree obstruction, and chain installation for ice conditions. The next morning, March 8, 2023, I began my return journey with extra attention to the locations where the impossible signs had predicted problems. At mile 60, I encountered the bridge washout, exactly as described. A section of road surface had collapsed overnight, creating a gap that required the alternate routing specified on the previous day's warning signs. The washout was fresh, with debris and water flow patterns indicating recent failure, but positioned precisely where the impossible sign had predicted it would occur. At mile 65, the road surface deterioration was exactly as warned. Overnight frost action had broken up the pavement in a pattern that made reduced speed necessary for safe passage. The deterioration extended from mile 65 to mile 67, matching the specific range mentioned on the warning sign I'd photographed the previous day. At mile 72, a large pine tree had fallen across the roadway, creating the single-lane obstruction that required careful navigation around its branches. The tree was positioned exactly where the sign had predicted, blocking the road in a way that allowed single-vehicle passage with appropriate caution. At mile 78, ice had formed on the road surface overnight, despite temperatures that should have prevented freezing. The ice formation created hazardous driving conditions that required the chains I had brought after seeing the previous day's warning signs. Every hazard predicted by the impossible signs had manifested exactly as described at the precise locations indicated, requiring the specific mitigation measures that had been recommended. I navigated each obstacle successfully because I had advance warning from signs that shouldn't have been able to predict tomorrow's road conditions with engineering precision. But as I reached the final hazard location and began the last stretch toward the highway, I realized that my truck was now positioned exactly where the most disturbing sign had been posted. A sign I hadn't understood when I'd first photographed it. Vehicle recovery operation mile 84. Search and rescue required. March 8, 2023. The search and rescue team found me there 6 hours later, exactly where the impossible sign had predicted they would need to conduct a recovery operation. My truck was positioned at mile marker 84, undamaged but immobilized by conditions that had developed exactly as described by warning signs that had been dated one day in the future. I still drive commercial routes across northern Ontario, but I pay closer attention now to warning signs that seem to know too much about tomorrow's hazards. Sometimes I see signs dated for future conditions, and I photograph them systematically, documenting infrastructure predictions that violate every principle of hazard management I learned during my engineering career. The most unsettling part isn't that the signs predict future problems. It's the growing certainty that they're not warnings about what might happen, but documentation of what has already been scheduled to occur, posted by authorities who work according to calendars that run ahead of the time the rest of us experience. The silence on Channel 19 spoke louder than any voice I'd ever heard, and the terrifying part was knowing that everyone else thought I was losing my mind. My name is Samantha Rivers, Sam to anyone who's worked the northern routes, and I spent 6 years driving convoy security in Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian freight work in 2022. Military transport teaches you that communication discipline can mean the difference between successful mission completion and catastrophic failure. When you're responsible for moving critical supplies through hostile territory, you learn to listen to every transmission, monitor multiple frequencies simultaneously, and never ignore unusual radio activity that might indicate developing threats. The transition to civilian ice road trucking in northern Ontario seemed straightforward compared to overseas convoy operations. The routes were challenging but predictable. The hazards were environmental rather than human, and the CB radio networks provided the same sense of connected community that military communications had offered. Channel 19 was the primary frequency where ice road drivers shared weather updates, hazard warnings, and the professional camaraderie that made isolated wilderness driving bearable. My first season running freight to communities like Pickle Lake, Big Trout Lake, and the remote First Nation settlements had gone smoothly. I'd established relationships with regular drivers, learned the seasonal patterns of the winter access roads, and adapted my military communication protocols to the more relaxed but equally professional standards of civilian trucking. The CB radio was my primary connection to other drivers during long, solitary runs through territory where cell phone coverage didn't exist, and help might be hours away in emergency situations. On February 3rd, 2023, I was hauling medical supplies and emergency equipment to Pickle Lake when Channel 19 began broadcasting transmissions that changed everything I understood about radio communication. The first transmission came through at normal signal strength and clarity, activating my receiver and interrupting other traffic on the frequency. But instead of voice content, the transmission carried approximately 40 seconds of absolute silence. Not static, not background noise, not equipment malfunction, but deliberate quiet that felt purposeful and directed. I followed standard radio procedure for unclear transmissions. Channel 19, this is Sam Rivers, northbound on Pickle Lake Access. You're coming through with strong signal but no voice content. Please check your microphone and repeat your transmission. No response. But 15 minutes later, another silent transmission, this one lasting nearly a minute and arriving with enough power to override other radio traffic completely. After the third silent transmission, I began to notice something that military training had taught me to recognize patterns within apparent randomness. The duration of each silent broadcast varied, but the intervals between transmissions followed a mathematical sequence. More importantly, each silent transmission seemed to arrive precisely when I was approaching sections of road that required increased attention or caution. Channel 19, this is northbound Sam. I'm receiving your silent transmissions, and I understand you're providing route advisories, confirming reduced speed for the next section. The response from Big Mike Thompson, a veteran driver I'd worked with several times, came immediately. Sam, who are you talking to? Nobody's been on 19 for the past 20 minutes, except you. The silent transmissions, Mike. Strong signals with no voice content, but they're timed to match hazard locations. Sam, your radio might be malfunctioning. I'm not receiving any transmissions except your responses to whatever you think you're hearing. This concerned me more than equipment failure would have. Military experience had taught me to trust my equipment and my observations, but Big Mike was monitoring the same frequency from less than 50 kilometers away. If my radio was receiving signals he couldn't detect, the problem was either highly localized or highly personal. The silent transmissions continued throughout the day, arriving with consistent timing that correlated exactly with road conditions requiring special attention. Before encountering ice formations, wildlife crossings, rough pavement, or other hazards, I would receive a silent transmission of specific duration that somehow conveyed detailed information about the nature and location of the upcoming challenge. I began responding to each silent transmission as if it were providing specific hazard warnings. Channel 19, Sam here. I copy your advisory about the moose crossing at kilometer marker 67, reducing speed and watching for animals on the roadway. Big Mike's voice carried increasing concern. Sam, there's no moose crossing marked at 67. Who's giving you these traffic advisories? I'm the only other driver on this route today, and I haven't transmitted any hazard warnings. But when I reached kilometer marker 67, a cow moose and her calf were standing directly in the roadway, exactly where the silent transmission had somehow indicated they would be. I stopped safely and waited for them to move off the road, avoiding what could have been a fatal collision at highway speed. Mike, I just encountered the moose crossing that the silent transmission warned me about. Two animals standing in the roadway at the exact location indicated. Long pause. Sam, that's impossible. Nobody transmitted any moose warning. I've been monitoring 19 continuously, and the only voice I'm hearing is yours, talking to dead air. As the day continued, the pattern became undeniable. Each silent transmission provided accurate advance warning about hazards that weren't visible from my current position. Bridge icing, fallen trees, rough pavement sections, mechanical problems with other vehicles I hadn't yet encountered. The information was consistently accurate, specifically detailed, and delivered with timing that allowed me to take appropriate precautions. But according to every other driver monitoring Channel 19, I was having detailed conversations with transmissions that didn't exist, responding to radio traffic that no one else could receive. The most unsettling incident occurred around sunset, when the silent transmissions suddenly changed character. Instead of the measured, informational quiet I'd been receiving, the silence became urgent, rapid bursts of dead air that felt like emergency communications requiring immediate response. Channel 19, Sam here. I understand there's an emergency situation ahead requiring immediate assistance. I'm increasing speed and preparing for rescue operations. Big Mike's voice was sharp with concern now. Sam, what emergency? There's no one on the radio except you. Your GPS shows empty road for the next 30 kilometers. What rescue operations are you talking about? But as I crested the next hill, I found a jackknife transport truck blocking both lanes, with the driver standing in knee-deep snow, trying to signal for help. His CB radio had been damaged in the accident, leaving him unable to call for assistance. The emergency was exactly as the silent transmissions had indicated: vehicle accident, requiring immediate response from other drivers in the area. I spent 2 hours helping extract the driver and clear the roadway, working with him to get his truck repositioned safely. Throughout the rescue operation, I continued receiving silent transmissions that somehow provided specific information about recovery procedures, equipment requirements, and safety precautions. How did you know about my accident? The stranded driver asked as we finished securing his load. I've been stuck here for 3 hours with no way to call for help. I received radio advisories about your situation, I replied. From who? My CB equipment was destroyed in the jackknife, and I haven't seen any other traffic all day. I completed my delivery to Pickle Lake that evening and spent hours reviewing the day's events, trying to understand how I'd received accurate hazard information from radio transmissions that other drivers couldn't detect. My equipment logs showed clear records of signal reception and transmission timing, but the content of those signals consisted entirely of measured silence. My final log entry that day read, Channel 19, receiving silent transmissions containing critical safety information. Source unknown. Accuracy verified by field conditions. Phenomenon appears limited to my equipment or reception capability. Recommend continued monitoring despite lack of voice content. The next morning, Big Mike approached me at the truck stop with a concerned expression. Sam, I listened to recordings of yesterday's radio traffic. You had detailed conversations about hazards, weather conditions, and emergency situations. But on the recordings, there's nothing but your voice responding to dead air. You were talking to silence for 8 straight hours. I still monitor Channel 19 for the silent transmissions, though I've learned to be more discreet about responding to them when other drivers are listening. The silence continues to provide advance warning about hazards, accurate information about road conditions, and emergency advisories that have prevented several accidents over the past year. Other drivers have started requesting me as convoy leader for challenging routes, noting that I seem to have exceptional situational awareness and hazard prediction capabilities. They don't know that my advance warning comes from transmissions they can't hear, from communications that exist in frequencies of silence rather than voice. The most disturbing realization isn't that I'm receiving information from sources that don't speak, it's the growing understanding that some forms of communication transcend the limitations of human language, and that the most important warnings might come through channels where silence carries more meaning than words ever could. The most disturbing thing about cargo that delivers itself is finding your own signature on receipts for journeys you never took, to places you never went. My name is Howard Patterson, though everyone calls me Hoss, and I've been running freight across northern Ontario for 34 years. At 58, I was planning my final winter season before retirement, one last run through the seasonal roads and ice routes that had defined my adult life. After 3 decades of navigating challenging terrain, unpredictable weather, and the isolation that comes with wilderness freight hauling, I thought I understood everything about long-distance trucking that mattered for professional survival. The seasonal road to Moosonee was one of my regular winter routes, a challenging but familiar journey that connected the remote community on James Bay to the southern supply network. Moosonee served as a transportation hub for the northern communities, and during winter months when other access was limited, freight truckers like me provided the essential supplies that sustained settlements throughout the region. The route required crossing frozen rivers, navigating through dense forest, and maintaining precise timing to ensure deliveries arrived when receiving facilities were staffed and operational. My truck was a Burgundy Peterbilt that I'd owned for 12 years, configured specifically for northern freight work, with heavy-duty heating systems, reinforced suspension for rough terrain, and GPS tracking equipment that my dispatch office used to monitor delivery progress and ensure driver safety. After 34 years of professional driving, I took pride in maintaining detailed logbooks, accurate fuel records, and precise documentation of every delivery, pickup, and route modification that occurred during my runs. On March 9, 2024, I loaded a mixed cargo of medical supplies, communications equipment, and general freight for delivery to 3 locations along the Moosonee route. The manifest listed stops at Cochrane, Moosonee itself, and Moose Factory, with specific delivery times and contact information for each receiving facility. The total distance was approximately 600 kilometers, requiring careful coordination with multiple receivers and precise timing to complete all deliveries within the day. The journey began routinely. I departed Timmins at 5 in the morning with a full load, following the familiar route north, through increasingly remote terrain toward the James Bay communities. My GPS showed normal progress, fuel consumption remained within expected parameters, and radio communications with dispatch confirmed that I was maintaining the scheduled timeline for my first delivery in Cochrane. Around noon, as I approached what should have been the Cochrane delivery point, I began experiencing periods of memory discontinuity that concerned me more than any mechanical problem would have. I would find myself driving along the route with no clear recollection of the previous hour or two, as if I'd been operating on autopilot, while my conscious attention was focused elsewhere. During these gaps, my truck continued making normal progress, according to the GPS tracking system, but I couldn't remember specific details about road conditions, weather changes, or the routine observations that normally occupied my attention during long drives. The first clear indication that something was wrong came when I arrived in Cochrane to make my scheduled delivery. The receiving supervisor at the medical center approached my truck with a confused expression. "Haas, we already received our delivery this morning," he said, checking his clipboard. "You dropped off the medical supplies around 9:30. Everything was properly documented and signed for." I checked my logbook and manifest. According to my records, this was my first stop of the day, and I'd never been to Cochrane before this arrival. But the supervisor showed me a completed delivery receipt with my signature, timestamped at 9:30 that morning, confirming that I delivered the medical supplies exactly as scheduled. I don't remember making any delivery here, I told him. According to my log, this is my first stop. He showed me security camera footage of my truck arriving that morning, with a clear view of me getting out of the cab, supervising the unloading process, and signing the delivery receipt. The footage was timestamped and showed me conducting a normal delivery procedure that I had no memory of performing. But my truck was still fully loaded with all the cargo listed on my manifest, including the medical supplies that the Cochrane facility had apparently already received and properly stored. I continued to Musani, increasingly concerned about the memory gaps and the impossible documentation of deliveries I couldn't recall making. During the drive, I experienced several more periods where my attention seemed to disconnect from the immediate driving environment, only to return to awareness with my truck having made normal progress along the route. When I arrived in Musani, the receiving coordinator at the community center greeted me with the same confusion I'd encountered in Cochrane. "Hoss, you completed our delivery about 2 hours ago. The communications equipment is already installed and operational. Is there some problem with the paperwork?" Again, he showed me a completed delivery receipt with my signature and the correct timestamp, along with security footage of my truck at their facility during the afternoon delivery period. But my truck remained fully loaded with all the cargo that should have been delivered throughout the day. The pattern repeated at Moose Factory, where the freight coordinator confirmed that I'd made their scheduled delivery earlier in the afternoon, providing signed receipts and security footage of a delivery process I couldn't remember performing. By evening, I had completed all 3 scheduled deliveries according to the receiving facility's documentation, signed all the appropriate paperwork, and satisfied every requirement of my shipping manifest. But my truck remained fully loaded with the same cargo I'd started with that morning, despite having apparently delivered identical shipments to all 3 destinations. I called my dispatch office to report the situation, trying to explain the discrepancy between the completed deliveries and my fully loaded truck. "Hoss, your GPS tracking shows normal progress to all 3 delivery points today," the dispatcher explained. "The system logged your arrivals and departures at Cochrane, Musani, and Moose Factory exactly according to schedule. All receivers have confirmed successful deliveries." "But I still have all the cargo in my trailer," I replied. "The truck is fully loaded with everything that was supposed to be delivered." Long pause. "That doesn't make sense, Hoss. The GPS data shows your truck was at all 3 delivery locations during the scheduled time windows. Are you sure you're checking the right trailer?" I walked back to examine my cargo bay thoroughly. The truck was definitely loaded with medical supplies, communications equipment, and general freight that matched my original manifest exactly. Nothing had been unloaded. Nothing was missing, and the cargo securing systems showed no signs of having been opened or disturbed during the day. But my paperwork showed completed deliveries, signed receipts, and satisfied shipping requirements for all 3 destinations. According to every official record, I had successfully delivered identical cargo loads to multiple locations while somehow retaining the original shipment in my truck. That evening, I reviewed the GPS tracking data that my dispatch office provided. The electronic records showed my truck traveling to all 3 delivery locations, stopping for appropriate durations at each facility, and completing the round-trip journey within normal time parameters. But the data also showed something impossible: simultaneous position reports indicating my truck had been at multiple locations during overlapping time periods. According to GPS logs, my truck had been in Cochrane making a delivery at the same time it was traveling toward Musani. It had been unloading in Musani while simultaneously conducting business in Moose Factory. The electronic tracking system showed my vehicle existing in multiple locations simultaneously, as if it were following parallel routes to complete identical deliveries during the same time periods. The security footage from all 3 facilities showed identical delivery procedures: the same truck, the same driver, the same cargo being unloaded and documented. But each recording showed me performing deliveries that I had no memory of making, signing receipts for cargo that remained in my truck throughout the day. I completed my final winter season and retired as planned, but the experience at Musini left me questioning everything I thought I understood about the relationship between time, distance, and memory. The most unsettling aspect wasn't the missing time or the impossible deliveries. It was the realization that some part of me had been conducting business, making decisions, and signing documents, while my conscious awareness was experiencing a completely different version of the same day. Sometimes I wonder if retirement is just another word for finally admitting that you've been driving routes you don't remember, to destinations that exist in the spaces between where you think you've been and where the paperwork says you actually went. The cargo delivers itself, the signatures appear where they need to be, and the only mystery left is figuring out which version of the journey was real and which one was just the story we tell ourselves about driving from one point to another in a straight line through time that apparently isn't as linear as the road maps suggest.